Hello everyone, Tartarus today, and this video, and this video, and that video.
Bishop Baron, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure.
It's been a while since
Why
we
do we
last
have to warm
spoke.
up?
We had a debate, I think
Oh,
a
yeah,
couple
of
of years
course.
ago on Justin Brierley's show.
Right.
And it seemed to be received quite well. I'm not sure what it was about that particular debate, but watching it back, I think that we have a slightly different approach to the question of philosophy and religion. I noticed that when you speak quite poetically and almost motivationally about faith. I try to be quite cold and analytical in that discussion,
wait.
but I'm hoping that today...
I'm not sure it's loud enough for you. I might do this, I might do this, maybe.
We'll be able to talk a little bit more on your terms and not have a debate, but a conversation this time. And I wanted to begin by asking you about something I've noticed, especially in the online space and amongst young people, which is an increase in the popularity of so-called self-help movement. There'll be all kinds of YouTubers and books that are sold, but also in the intellectual space, people like Jordan Peterson, a lot of their popularity is driven by the sense of meaning that there seems to reinvigorate people's lives with. And I think the most astonishing thing about this is the demand for that kind of material. It says to me that we might be living through something like a crisis of meaning. And I wondered if you shared that opinion, and if so, what you think's causing it.
Yeah, I do share that opinion. We're in such a culture of self-invention. You know, the priority is given to the ego to kind of invent its own values and even to invent itself. And the roots of that go back, go to Nietzsche, come to Sartre, and into Foucault and people like that, which has now become the default position of most young people in the West, I would say, that we invent ourselves, we invent our own values. And I think, if you want to mention someone like Peterson, he's appealing to, I'd call them objective values. And a meaningful life is one that's lived in some kind of purposive relationship to a value, I would say. That when you discover, you intuit a value, whether that's epistemic or aesthetic or moral, and then you order your life according to that value, you're living meaningfully. To me, it's an illusion to think you can invent your own purpose, you can invent your own meaning. I think you discover that. And those are the best moments in life, you know, and they're recorded in some of the great literature of the world, those moments when an aesthetic value appears. A moral value makes a demand on us, or an epistemic value appears. And you say, that's truth, I need to give myself to it. I think that's what makes life meaningful. And the crisis is that there's great doubt about the validity and objectivity of those values. Subjectivity can be very attractive, like, well, I make it up as I go along, but it's, in the end, not attractive. In the end, it's spiritually debilitating. And I do think that's why people like Peterson and others are so appealing, especially to young men, because they're appealing in a kind of tough spiritual director way, a tough guru way, to those objective values.
You said that the idea of inventing your own meaning, inventing your own purpose, is a vacuous one. I think I tend to agree with you, but I wonder if you'd be able to spell out for our audience why you think that's the case. It's one of the most common views that we hear in response to people throwing off religion. If you become an atheist, one of the problems you run into is, still or not, the claim is made that without some kind of religious grounding, you can't have any objective meaning. And rather than saying, yes, we can, a lot of people decide to say, well, we don't need objective meaning, we make it up for ourselves. What's the problem with that?
Well, first of all, I would say this, that an atheist can certainly be deeply in touch with objective values. Epistemic, moral, and aesthetic. And that's what would give that person's life meaning. So I don't hold to the view that ipso facto an atheist has a meaningless life, because I think they can intuit.
This guy's already like pretty not, I don't know, open-minded. I'm not sure. Finding meaning or purpose in God, it's still your meaning. It's no different than finding meaning in anything else. You are the one who decides what your meaning is. You think it's in God, or rather think it's in drinking coffee and eating Max Fun bars. It's no different. You're the one who made the decision.
Meaning all over the place. Now, if you really press it philosophically, I would argue that those objective values are ordered hierarchically and they point finally to a ground or source of their meaning. So that's, from Plato on. We have all kinds of people in the great tradition that would argue just that way. So I think the more you live in the world of objective values, it will lead you toward the source of that value, meaning God. So I think that's true. But I wouldn't contest with you that an atheist can live a meaningful life. They can intuit all these different values. The trouble with self-invention to me is it's living in this sort of clean, well-lighted space of my own little subjectivity. And I don't allow the objective to break through into me and to broaden my life. It's like your countryman Chesterton's thing about you need to crack some holes in the skull to let in the light. The problem is a sort of self-absorption, or Augustine called it being curvatus in cero, right? I'm caved in around myself. And that's what happens, I would argue, when you walk into the Sainte-Chapelle, or you see a Cézanne painting, or you grasp the truth of a mathematical formula, or you look up into the heavens, or it's Kant, the starry sky above and the moral law within, that when you intuit these great values, it's like it's an epiphany, it's a showing, it's a breakthrough. And that's what gives life meaning. When you say, well, I'm going to invent it for myself, to me it's very tiresome and vacuous and small. It's a small space. Augustine talked about the pusilla anima, the little...
No, God, this is no fucking different. And what does it mean, invent? I don't think that's the correct word. Invent, it's like bring something new. But you don't bring anything new into the world or even into your own world. You just decide what you want to relabel as your meaning. So there's always been God, right? Like the idea of God has always been around. And then you label it as your purpose and your meaning. Just like with drinking coffee and eating Max Fun bars. That idea, that activity, the idea of that activity, it's always, or maybe not always, been around. Just like God. God hasn't been around when you were 3 or 2 years old, something like that. Depending on when you got accustomed with the idea of God. When was the first time they tried to indoctrinate you? And so, yes, it's just relabeling.
Little soul. And the little soul, I think, is born of that self-invention prejudice. The great soul, the magna anima, is when objective value breaks in and then I can move into a higher perspective.
Do you think that people who say, well, I'm just going to invent my own meaning in life, are essentially just coping with the fact that they're beginning to recognize that their worldview doesn't have any grounding for objective meaning?
Yeah, my guess is that when they say that, they don't really mean it. They are, in fact, in touch with objective value. But they're so enamored of the value of freedom, which, by the way, is a value. I mean, personal freedom is a great moral value. But if you valorize that to the nth degree, then you get into this problem. I think people that say I'm inventing my value, in fact, very often are intuiting objective value, if you press them on it. Because we can't finally stay in that Sartrean space. Go right back to existentialism and humanism, when we said existence is injustice. I think that's now the default position of most people today in the West. But to me, that's just it's a going nowhere position. That my freedom invents who I am. No, my freedom finds itself in relationship to great values that call it and condition it and summon it to something higher. You know, that's when you're truly free.
Yeah, I mean, I've previously compared
That's
it to the
just
idea.
your
Well, I think it's
position.
helpful to try and understand what meaning means.
Yeah.
The term is often used interchangeably with something like purpose, and I think what we're talking about is something like a non-derivative reason to act or reason to be, is what purpose is.
Yeah.
And so the idea of having a reason to act, if you invent your own purpose, what it seems like you're doing is inventing some kind of task to fulfill or some kind of motivation to do something for its own sake.
Yeah.
It's like you don't actually have a real motivation to do something and that's why you do it, but the lack of any motivation causes you to create a task just for the sake of having a task to fulfill,
Yeah.
which
Oh,
seems...
so that's different now. So now meaning or purpose is a goal, maybe without an end. I wonder if that's still invention. I think it's just picking. You just decide what to chase. You just make a choice. Again. Make a choice to be happy or to make others happy or to make an existing and untrue an imaginary entity happy by, I don't know, praying. God is so fucking perfect. Why would he need anyone to pray to him?
A little circular, I suppose.
Right.
And we'd also be committed to the view, for instance, that if one person decides to invent their value by counting the blades of grass in their garden every day until they die, and another person decides to find their meaning and invent their purpose by raising money for Oxfam and lifting thousands of people out of poverty, that both of those people's lives are as meaningful as each other.
Yeah,
and that just seems wrong.
Yes, and that's the Sartrean problem. And Sartre himself knew it. If you say the authentic life, in his terms, is the one in which, my freedom has authentically chosen its own value. Well, Sartre chose to be part of the resistance, but then how do you say the Nazi isn't authentic? The Nazi has chosen his value based upon his freedom. So how do you adjudicate those two things? And see, I would say you have to rely not on your self-inventing freedom, but on some objective value. And I would be able to say, I think, the Nazi is radically out of step with proper moral value, and the member of the resistance was in touch with it. You can't simply appeal to the primacy of freedom and subjectivity, because then you get into precisely that dilemma. What I find, Alex, interesting here is it's one of Aquinas' implicit arguments for God's existence. So the famous ones based on the cosmology, but there's one based upon final causality. So here you are right now, and you're out of your room in your studio, and you're doing the show. So the first question, well, why? Why are you doing it? And you give an answer of some kind, like...
So, first dumb question we got here, guys and girls and non-binary individuals. Why are you doing it? Oh my god.
Like, well, because this is my livelihood.
Why are you fucking existing? Because you're addicted to life. Because that's your brain's purpose. To live. So to reproduce. And everything else is just trying to get you to reproduce. And sometimes those actions that are ultimately directed to you reproducing, to your genes being reciprocated, right? Replicated, not sure. Sometimes those actions are not, let's say, really contributing to you mating, because brain is dumb. Brain associates what brings you comfort with increased chance of survival. I think I said everything right. And yeah, that's why you doom scroll TikTok to survive.
Well, why is that your livelihood? Well, because I want to make money. Well, why do you want to make money? Well, for this end or that end. Well, why do you think those ends are important? But with any concrete moral act, the two of us are committing a moral act right now, right? We've chosen to do something we both think is good. Well, how come? Keep asking the why question over and over and over again. You'll come finally to some uncaused cause of the will, some summum bonum. You know, now, I call that God for all sorts of reasons we get into it. But let's say it's money, success, it's fame, it's power, it's whatever. But willy-nilly, everyone's got a summum bonum. That's why the Bible would say the choice is not between theism and atheism. It's always between right worship and false worship. What do you consider your summum bonum? Is it the true summum bonum, or is it some false summum bonum? But everyone's got
Alright, I guess
right?
I'm ready for Tartarus.
Teilhard said that.
Oh,
you
wait.
wouldn't get out of bed in the
What
morning
is
unless
this?
you were motivated by some finally unmoved mover of your will. And see, I think that's really worth thinking about. What is it that's motivating even the simplest moral act, like the two of us sitting down and having this conversation?
You said it's not between theism and atheism, but essentially choosing what it is you worship, or
Right.
choosing what it is you
True
follow.
worship or false
Because,
worship. Right.
because there has to be something, right? There has to be something motivating.
I really feel like 360 FPS suck after CBF. Maybe I'm just like insane. Just something feels wrong.
Action, if there wasn't some fundamental purpose or reason that underlies every other reason you have to act, then those reasons wouldn't exist. They don't have any power of their own thought. If you're motivated to go to work so that you can make money, without the reason for making money, where it might be to have a comfortable life, the reason of I want to make money doesn't exist anymore. It doesn't exist just to put something forward. It relies on something more fundamental, and this entire chain must lead back to a first cause. It's interesting. It's quite like arguments for the existence of God
But
in
it's
terms of
final-
cosmology or something.
It's like I spam perfectly, but it's not. It's not like that. Really. 360 FPS is not enough. Insane.
But it's about meaning.
Right, it's final causality, not efficient causality. And that's why it's hidden in the claim. It's not up front, like here are my 5 ways. But it's a hidden way. But it's actually closer in spirit to Aristotle himself, who thought the final cause was the most important. And so if you pursue final causality all the way, you come to some version of summum bonum, or what, Paul Tillich, the religious philosopher,
Oh my god.
talked about ultimate concern. Right? Everyone has an ultimate concern.
What was this?
You do, everyone does. If you didn't, you wouldn't act in any way. And Tillich always said, and I followed this in my own pastoral life, the most important question to ask about any person is, what does that person worship? Once you know that, you'll know the rest of that person's life pretty well. It'll fall into coherence. What's your ultimate concern? And he defined religion famously as ultimate concern. So in that way, then you've got either true religion, that's Augustine, vera religio, or you just got regular religio. You've got some form of false religion or false worship.
Now, what do you make of people who say that on an atheistic picture of the universe, what we essentially are as human beings are highly evolved mammals that have slowly developed this accidental consciousness to help us to survive?
Exactly.
And so the ultimate motivating factor behind all of our behaviors, even if it's subconscious,
Reproducing.
would be something just as simple as the drive to survive.
Yes. That's exactly it. I cannot believe Alex actually brought this up, because that completely ruins all of this guy's argumentation. It just sets a dot. It brings it to a conclusion, I don't know, an unfavorable conclusion for this guy.
Drive to reproduce.
There's nothing you can reply to this. You can only come up with some bogus. And that's what he's going to do for the next 10 minutes.
Reduce, because of course somebody's not likely to say this.
Ma.
Some people might reference their children, but on the cognitive level, we might reference having some belief in a set of ideals, but we might say that this is essentially a way that the brain tricks itself into being more likely to survive, because by having these invented ideals, it's
I
more
know what
likely
this
to
guy's
do the
going
work
to do.
that's going to lead us to survive.
He's
And
going
so
to mention
maybe that's
altruism.
the fundamental value, and I wouldn't say that, I wouldn't characterize it as people worshipping their survival.
And
It would be that this
altruism
is
is
the
not a
motivating
counter
factor,
argument.
and what they're actually worshipping is some invented ideal that just helps to prolong their survival.
I've never found that convincing. To me, that's just
What did
hopelessly
he-
reductionistic.
Their survival.
I've never found that convincing.
Of course you never did, silly.
To me, that's just hopelessly reductionistic. I mean, to take Hamlet and say somehow I can reduce that to the survival instinct. Or I can read Plato's Republic and say, well, that's finally all about the survival instinct or the divine comedy.
Of course you don't like
To me, it's
that.
hopelessly reductionistic. Is something like bodily survival, basic instincts, ingredient probably in everything we do? Yes, I would say, because we have bodies, and the bodies have evolved from lower forms, and they have all of those instincts and impulses. I wouldn't deny that for a minute. I'm not a Platonist in that way. But I do think there's something that transcends the merely animal dimension of our life, and it's revealed in
Doctors
things
is different.
like Hamlet and things like
Is it now the
our
same?
ultimate concern and our quest, not just for a particular beautiful thing, but for the source of beauty. And that's that very interesting moment. It's James
not
Joyce
sure.
in The Portrait of the Artist when he that famous scene looking out at the woman who would eventually be his wife, and he describes her in this rapturous way. And when she turns to look at him,
Let's
and then he says, "Oh, heavenly God," and that's the move from Plato through Dante up to James Joyce and many others. That
yes, that makes it easier.
through the particular beautiful thing, I'm triggered into an awareness of the source of beauty, the beauty that I'm
Makes me-
seeking
helps me
implicitly
focus.
in every particular
Oops.
beautiful thing. Or when you grasp a mathematical relationship and it's so powerful to you, and the truth of it is not just the evanescent truth of, well, that thing is in front of me right now. It's you grasp something that's true in any possible world, that's true at any place or time. That triggers an awareness of the source of truth. So that's how I think it works in a religious consciousness. But I go back to Plato with that intuition.
It's interesting how you characterize the position as being reductionist. I share your intuition that something like Hamlet, the idea that the production of it could be reduced to apes trying to survive,
Yeah.
seems incredible. But the two things I would say in response to that is, firstly, this is true of all evolutionary biology, and that I might talk about some minute facet of my body, like my eyelashes or something. And the idea that the development of these
my
particular hairs
God.
on the end of an eyelid somehow serve in the great survival of species on planet Earth, it seems so absurd and disconnected. But actually, if you draw a long enough chain of reasoning as to why we ended up here, it can be explained in those terms. And also, you said a moment ago that
Didn't know that this
all the
is
behaviors
possible.
that we participate in are motivated in some way, they're moral in some way, and there's some kind of ultimate motivation. And you said that you would call this God or ground it in God, meaning that, if I choose to read a book, or if I choose to get on a plane or go to the shop to buy some food, ultimately I'm being motivated by this religious structure. And in the same way that you say it seems absurd that Hamlet can be reduced to evolutionary biology, I might say, well, it seems absurd that me getting up and going to the shop and telling the guy to keep the change is inflatable to something like a religious structure. But I think you would say that, although that seems a little strange upon first hearing, there is a chain there that does ultimately is ultimately fully explained by religion. In the same way, maybe something like Hamlet and the immense awe that human beings feel upon looking upon their loves or upon understanding the universality
wait,
of
what?
mathematics
I
is
don't really understand
rather,
that. This is
depressingly, but perhaps just a very long offshoot of this struggle for survival.
Well, let's play with it a little bit. I mean, might you trace origins of these ideas back that way, possibly? but the experience of the idea itself in its full expression, that's where I'm balking to say, well, I'm going to sort of thereby debunk it and say, well, it's really nothing but, now fill in the blank, you know. We're bodies.
Right.
We come up from the earth, and we come up from these deeper, you know, animal instincts and all that. I don't deny that. But I don't think you believe for a second that when you're entertaining some really high-level mathematics,
I believe that.
even though the ultimate origin we could trace even, you know, biologically backward,
Oh my
that in
God.
itself it's reducible to a mere concern for survival.
It is.
But something's
I've done
opened up there
calculations.
that transcends that dimension, and that again, that's
There's
Plato
nothing-
escaping from the cave. That you've moved to a higher level of consciousness. I just balk at the reductionism because I think it mocks the truth of that experience. So bracket religion for a second. Just aesthetic experiences or epistemic experiences or really profound moral experiences. You know, when you see someone like a Maximilian Kolbe, an act of extraordinary saintly heroism in
Why?
the moral order, and you say, that's explicable in evolutionary terms. I mean, I just don't buy it. I think something has opened up that mocks that kind of reductionism.
I mean, it's
Explain
a strong intuition.
Kolbe. You know what I mean? Maximilian Kolbe, who gave his life in Auschwitz. He was not chosen by the Nazis. They chose 10 people at random
What?
to die because someone
Yeah,
escaped from
here, look, altruism.
the barracks. Kolbe came forward because there was a man that got to his knees and said, I have a wife and children. And so Kolbe came forward and said, I'm a Catholic priest, take me.
Altruism
And so
is
the
just a
Nazis happily
bug.
took him and then starved him to death. So he's one of the great martyr saints of the 20th century. I would submit to you, it's impossible to explain that
It's
on
not.
simply like evolutionary grounds or some variation of the survival instinct. I mean, I think it mocks the moral splendor of that act. And I think there's something that's concomitant in the epistemic and the
Oh, where was it
aesthetic
going
order
from?
too.
So this net.
I mean, do you think it's truly impossible? I mean, I understand that it's depressing and potentially insulting, as you suggest there with the term mocking, to reduce such an act of heroism to biological drives. But I think that people
Everything is
interested in
reduced
this
to
line of
it.
thought are
So
essentially
there's
trying
nothing.
to explain a phenomena. They're saying we have this phenomena of
There's nothing degrading like about that. Once you accept that everything is biological drive, you stop paying attention to the fact that it's just biological drive. Still a heroic, let's say, action to decide to save those guys and such and such and such.
these animals that decide
He
to
just doesn't like the labeling.
sacrifice themselves for each other. And somebody comes along and says, well, look, I mean, in the evolution of mankind, people share their genes. You know, if somebody is an adult, they might sacrifice themselves easily for their children on an evolutionary ground. It's so easy to see evolutionarily why it would be that a father would sacrifice himself for his children, especially if the father isn't going to have any more kids. On a purely survival of the genes approach, it's the most straightforward thing in the world to see why that would be the case. Similarly, you can see why it might happen for a brother or a cousin, and you can expand this to strangers who share some genetics
But
in
see
the
how
human
you're
race. Now,
stretching that so thin now. I mean, you're beginning with something, as you say, is somewhat credible, intelligible. But now you're stretching it. To read someone like Kolbe, understand his act of self-sacrifice that way, I just don't buy it. I mean, I get it. I've read the arguments that but I just don't think it honors the integrity of what's happening.
Honors.
but this is why I wanted to bring this up
There's
in this
nothing
way, is
honorable
to say
about
that
our
that
existence.
first step,
Bishop.
saying, well, the father sacrifices himself for his son or his children, let's say, and somebody comes along and says, I think this can be explained in terms of the survival of genes. I don't think it would be appropriate to say, well, you're mocking the sacrifice, or you're diminishing the sacrifice, or
No, I
you're
did it
ruining
again.
the
I don't
moral import of
know.
that sacrifice. I think all they're doing is explaining it, and so, you know, be it we may be sort of stretching things a bit more thinly, but the terminology that you used of trying to explain such
That's
a
actually
sacrifice.
that's a great strat, letting you play before really tight clicks, because even those 3 orbs that are free, they still ruin my actualization, precision
By
actualization.
reference to the survival of genes being first impossible. I think it's just impossible to describe it in these terms, and second that it mocks the moral sacrifice. If it doesn't do it in the first case of the father sacrificing himself for the children, why would it do it in the latter?
Because you've stretched that string so tight at that point. I mean, I think you've not honored the quantum has been crossed. There's something new that's emerged within human experience that can't just be reduced to a physical
What?
impulse. It's on a spectrum.
This
obviously,
guy
because
is a
we're-
religious
I would say
cock.
both visible and invisible, both body and soul, and there's elements that we can explain through recourse to material causality.
You're
But
a
then
typical
others, I just think
hypocrite.
a quantum's been crossed. And I always just sort of laugh. That's why I use the Hamlet example. That it just seems so ludicrous to
Oh
me
my
to
God.
say that that's understandable utterly. I mean, maybe in certain respects, or in the beginning of the analysis or something, but that utterly Hamlet's explicable in terms of evolutionary principle strikes me as ludicrous. And the same with high moral acts like the Colby Act, or, you know, in any of the 3 basic orders.
Yeah, I mean, I can see why you think it would be stretching an explanation thin, but I mean, as you say, you're familiar with.
Oh my god.
I mean, there's a wealth of literature and a wealth of generally scientists, I think, are of this view. When you hear people talking about reducing morality to evolutionary drive, it's often a scientist rather than a philosopher who's talking about it. But this is a view that's held, and it's a view that's quite popular, certainly among secular scientists and philosophers. I was just surprised to hear you so flatly describe it as impossible.
No, I
to
didn't say impossible.
describe this
I
kind
said the beginnings of the analysis might participate at that level, but I think a quantum is crossed at some point where that becomes ludicrously inadequate as an explanation. So I don't think you believe that. Whenever I talk to people or dialogue with people who are defending that
Oh
position,
my
I
God.
don't honestly think you believe that. That Hamlet or Maximilian Kolbe or the Sistine ceiling
I
is
do.
utterly explicable in terms of evolutionary impulse.
Yes,
I don't think you believe that, because to me that's such a ludicrous position. to
you're
hold.
afraid.
And it's animated, let's be honest, by a scientism. It's not animated by like pure objective science. It's by
Whatever.
the
One
assumption that reality must be reducible to the physical. So I'm going to make this finally ludicrous claim that these very high spiritual and moral values are purely explicable
Very high
in terms of
spiritual
their
moral
evolutionary
values.
foundation.
Oh,
I think it's motivated by a philosophical prejudice much more than objective science.
I mean, certainly, I would hesitate to recommend that people assume that a materialistic explanation ought always be favoured. There's this idea, which I think is what you're describing as scientism here, that
Yeah.
should there be a materialistic hypothesis, there should be some kind of bias or some kind of some kind of automatic leaning towards that explanation over a non-material explanation. I don't think we should do that. I think that explaining human action in terms of an ultimate sense of spirituality and belief in God is a powerful explanation. I also do think that explaining human action in terms of an evolutionary drive. So, for example, I've talked in a few podcasts now about this idea of terror management theory, which I don't know if you've come across, but it's the idea that human beings are ultimately motivated by a fear of their own death at the
yes,
same time as a
yes.
recognition of its own of the inevitability of their death.
Except human brains don't understand what death is.
And so human beings are unique in
They don't understand that, so what actually motivates them is the fear of not being able to reproduce. So when you lose your status in society, when you're a foundational incel, you might kill yourself. Even though death is not an issue for you, the issue is that you won't be able to let your genes replicate. And this is what the brain is afraid of. And death, usually when, when you're dead, you can't really reproduce. And that's why brain's afraid of death.
The sense that all animals are going to die, but human beings seem unique in having a recognition of that mortality. And so when we ask, why is
They
it that only
understand it
human beings
consciously,
produce
but
things
not
like Hamlet?
subconsciously.
Maybe because engaging in art like this is a way to escape
God,
death in the sense of having something of yourself that outlasts your physical death. Now, of course, this is a scientific hypothesis about how the brain works. It might be true, it might be false, but it seems at least plausible to me. It doesn't seem ludicrous and totally out of the question to suggest that the reason why people produce works like Hamlet, and indeed the reason why people engage in spiritual affairs like religion, the reason why people produce music, and the reason why if somebody finds out they're about to die, it might motivate them to finish that magnum opus.
But that's, again, so reductionistic, because that's all Shakespeare was doing. All he was concerned about was making sure that his reputation endures over the ages. I mean, maybe somewhere in his consciousness he was thinking about that, but I think what he was motivated by, if you ask me, is the sheer beauty and truth that he intuited, and he wanted artistically to express in this sublime manner.
That's nonsense, guy.
I mean, I don't think he was in his room thinking, I gotta make sure my reputation. I mean, who cares? Finally, if I'm gonna die like an animal, go to the ground, I don't care if anyone remembers me. Why would I? So to me, that's so implausible. I think Shakespeare was a genius who, like all geniuses, intuited values at a very high level and wanted to express that because it was lovely so to do. You know, and I'm just balking at this.
And you don't like truth.
Very scientific prejudice that says, oh, no, that can't be right. I don't think Shakespeare worried that much about his stupid reputation. Do you, honestly?
Well, to be clear, I don't think that I don't think that the alternative that you're providing here is silly or should be thrown out. I'm just presenting an alternative here, and of course Shakespeare isn't consciously thinking of these things. This is what terror management theory is all about, is that we essentially have a subconscious drive towards doing things which allow us to outlive ourselves. It's why human beings have an obsession with doing things that are larger than themselves, because of the fact that, as you say, if you know you're just an animal and you're just going to die, life becomes purposeless and nihilistic. But purposelessness and nihilism are very uncomfortable positions to hold, and that's why human beings invent these ways to try to outlive themselves, because of the fact that they recognize that they're going to die one day, and that will be the end of it. I mean, for example,
I'll tell you what I don't buy, because you're such a smart guy, and you've had that experience of intuiting great value. You know what that's like. What a sublime moment that is.
That's condescending.
And it's something beyond simply physical survival or beyond physical preoccupations. And appeal to unconscious all you want, but you know what that's like when you've grasped a truth or something beautiful or splendid or transcendently good. It's
You're
more than just the body
nonsense.
going on there. You know, so I'm trying to speak out of, I think, the mainstream of the Western philosophical tradition and resisting a materialistic reductionism. You know what reminds me of Alex very much is Hobbesian political philosophy versus Aristotelian. So Hobbes is one of the masters of this approach. Human beings are just motivated by fear of violent death. And so all the things that we've done about the moral purpose of government, what makes the state just, all states are there, is to protect us from each other. We're animals toward each other, so life is nasty, brutish, and short, and so we need the Leviathan state to come in and organize things. And Hobbes felt it was thereby producing a political science, as opposed to all this airy-fairy political philosophy that came before him. But I'm with Aristotle. I'm against that sort of materialistic reductionism. There's something splendid about politics, I think. There's something of great moral value about it that Aristotle and Aquinas and all those great figures saw. And Hobbes, I think, was a father in many ways of the position that not that you're defending it yourself personally, but you're defending it. And I just feel the need to stand athwart that position.
I wonder what you think. Suppose Shakespeare were to find out, he's writing his latest play, and he finds out secretly that, 2 years after he dies, just after he dies, the entire world is going to be destroyed by some nuclear accident or something. Every single human being is going to die. Do you think this would have the effect of motivating him to write as much as he can? Or do you think this would have the effect of saying, well, then there's no point? Because to me, I
Well,
don't
then
know about
there's no
Shakespeare, but
point.
for many people, I think...
Although 2 years is not... 2 years is not so, like, little. And again, it's really hard, very difficult to imagine that, like, really believing that the world is going to end in 2 years. It's hard even hypothetically to imagine a person really believing that without a doubt. Because brain does not know what death is. And so brain probably just can't know what the end of the world and eventually death is.
think that, you know, if I found out that the world was going to end in a week or just after I die or something, my motivation to produce these podcasts would completely collapse because I would feel like, you know, there's intuitively no point in doing so. But that says to me that at least part of the motivation for what I'm doing here is that there's something that is going to, you know, outlast me, and I'm not just doing it for its own sake of being intrinsically worthwhile,
I
but
can
because I
believe
know
I
that
can
if it were
believe
the case that it was all going to come to nothing very shortly, I wouldn't be as motivated. That says to me that it does have perhaps more to do with you know, what I'm suggesting than with what you're suggesting.
Well, but it is all going to come to an end. I mean, whether it's tomorrow or next week or in billions of years, it will. I mean, Michelangelo's
You
David
saw
will be
that.
nothing. Shakespeare's Hamlet will disappear. Nothing will last forever. Of course, I know that. Every artist and every philosopher knows that. In a way, who cares? I think you do it because it's good so to do. And in
No.
fact, it links you to a transcendent realm. So I would flip it around. That you discover the transcendent precisely through these breakthroughs, these epiphanies. There's Joyce again, right? His job as a
I
writer
forgot.
was to report epiphanies, he said. Beautiful. Even though he repudiated the church, which he did, but he was inescapably Catholic, James Joyce, because that's a deeply Catholic instinct. He wanted to be a priest for a time, but he became indeed a priest, but of a literary order, because he now was a minister of epiphany. And his artistry was meant to display that.
I'm so weak.
And when you do that, I would say authentically, you're in touch with a transcendent value that will transcend the world, that does indeed exist at a higher level than the world. So in a way, who cares how long the world survives or not? You do it because it's splendid so to do. That's why Kolbe, you know, gave up his life for someone he barely knew this man, but gave his life to him for him. I think those are what values are like, and that's where meaning comes from.
I want to shift gears based on something that we were
I
just talking
hate
about,
that
which
last
is
clip,
death
it's
and
so
death's
hard, you
inevitability.
cannot really fucking see
Is
anything.
it possible for a Christian who believes that there is life after death to see human death as a tragedy?
Well, not ultimately. I mean, I think we can see it as a tragedy within the framework of this world, but we hold to a divine comedy. I mean, we hold to an ultimate purpose to
Oh my
the world,
God.
to creation. So death, you know, we would tend into it as a doorway to a higher type of consciousness, a higher realm of experience. So it depends on how you define
Like,
tragedy,
what?
I suppose.
What?
Not in the ultimate sense. I mean, we hold to a sort of comic view of the world.
It seems difficult to be rationally upset at the passing of somebody who lives a good life and you know, you're pretty convinced is going to go to heaven. It seems difficult to,
I never thought that I
obviously it
would
makes sense to be upset,
survive.
but do you think there's an irrationality in being upset over it, in the knowledge that such people aren't really gone and are in a better place where you'll be reunited with them eventually?
Well, no, but there's upset and there's upset.
No.
You could be upset in the immediacy and your psychological pain in losing someone you love. Of course, you're
No.
upset. And then there's upset in the ultimate sort of cosmic sense. And I would hope that a believing Christian would avoid
How did I
that sort
survive
of
the
desperate
ship?
view. But it doesn't mean we're not upset at the immediacy
You saw the
of the
trajectory.
loss of someone we love.
Is life after death here the key to meaning, given that we were talking a moment ago about the fact that if we're just animals,
No.
then what's the point? Do you think that without this
What am I
afterlife. Like
doing?
if somebody was a theist who believed in an objective creator, an objective value, let's say, but it all comes to an end and we take an annihilationist view of everybody, everyone just ceases to exist, would that be a meaningless worldview as well?
Not completely or utterly. I think you can still find something
I
like meaning
felt
as
that
you
I
intuit
completely
values
stopped.
around you. Let's say you're an atheist and you say there is
Am I
no
doing
God, there's no
45
life
though?
after death. But indeed, I have intuited epistemic and moral and aesthetic values. Fine. I think, and if you have a purposive relationship to those values, then you have a meaningful life. Now, again, there's meaningful and there's meaningful. I'd say there's meaningful small m. Meaningful capital M would be those values speak of a higher. They're like an opening of a window to a higher and eternal and permanent value. And it's in purposive relationship to that value that life has ultimate meaning.
And so is this what religion can offer somebody with regards to meaning and fulfillment and purpose that atheism cannot?
Yeah.
So imagine that you're speaking to somebody who agrees with you that an
Wait.
atheistic worldview can't ground objective meaning, and that subjective meaning doesn't cut it. It doesn't have the force that we actually value in meaning. And they agree that what we essentially need in order to ground our objective meaning is belief in some form of God or belief in some kind of ultimate truth. But they just don't. And they try, but they can't. For such people, what are they to do when they don't disagree that meaning should be grounded in God, but they just can't seem to find God, and therefore leave what they believe to be a meaningless life?
Depends on the person and depends on their situation in life. What I mean there is you could argue with someone. Because to me, the position you're describing is like someone who would say there's a radically contingent world, but there's no ground of contingency. I think that's an incoherent position. So if you hold that, I would try to argue you out of it. In the same way to say there are really objective values, but there's no transcendent ground or explanation for them, is an incoherent position, I would say. And I use everyone from Plato
I cannot
through
believe
contemporary
that.
times to try to show that. But more often than not, you don't argue people into it. You accompany them. I've used Pope Francis's language. You accompany people, and you help them to see how these values do in fact open on to a higher
What?
ground. Usually, we would say saints who are living in and out of that higher space, that best witness to it. And so it's the holiness of people around them
My
that shows
hand
them
is weak.
the ground of ultimate meaning and truth. So to some degree it's arguing, but I think to a large extent it's showing. It's an accompaniment by a saint. I don't mean just a canonized saint, I mean by a holy person. I mean someone who's whole and more integrated, that often opens the window. I'd say too, as a Catholic, that's the point of liturgy. The liturgy has a rational dimension to it. It's filled with words and so on. But a lot of the liturgy is non-rational.
Should
It's
play
sense
from
experience,
zero.
it's smoke and it's colors and it's lights and
Maybe.
it's gesture.
Just to get the
It's
hang
like
of
a dance, as Thomas Merton said, like a
thirst
ballet.
or
It's
this.
with certain prescribed movements and gestures. Well, I mean, all up and down the tradition, people who were moved by the liturgy to suddenly the window opens, the door opens, or use the metaphor, change the metaphor, the floor opens and you go down to a deeper place. That can happen through the aesthetics of the liturgy. It can happen through the witness of a saint. It can happen through rational argument.
My hand.
So I'd use any and all of those, depending on the person.
I want to talk about Christianity
hand.
in particular, because we've spoken about meaning and about theism broadly, but the Christian story has some peculiarities, and I wonder if you could summarize what you think the central message of Christianity is, as opposed to other world religions.
Jesus Christ is risen from the dead.
And the significance of this is it related to life after death? Is it related to forgiveness? Is it related to God being privy to the human
cannot believe
condition?
this.
Yes, all that.
How to
I would
turn
say
yourself into a
another,
clown.
shorthand, St. Paul used it, Jesus Kyrie, Jesus is Lord. It's another way of stating the essence of Christianity. But I'll stay with the first one, the resurrection, which is the euangelion. That's the good news, the glad tidings. That God, who journeyed all the way down to the very bottom of the human condition, entering into absolutely everything that terrifies us. It was, you mentioned Jordan Peterson earlier. He had a good little piece on the cross where he said that. But you look at the cross of Jesus, you see physical suffering at its limit. You see death itself. You see humiliation. You see the abandonment of someone by his friends. You see betrayal. You see institutional injustice. Every little thing that terrifies us about being human is on vivid display on the cross. And Paul says that's the one thing I'm preaching. I'm going to show you this. And it horrified people in the ancient world. It horrified them. The cross. To see a cross was horrific. But Christians held it up. Now why? Because in the resurrection they saw that the love of God, having journeyed all the way into all of that, is more powerful than all of that. It can bear us despite all of that. And therefore it represents a victory. The church fathers talk about Christus Victor, Christ the victor. Well, over what? Over all of that. Over everything that terrifies us. God's love is more powerful. So there's Paul. I'm certain that neither death nor life, nor angels nor principalities, nor height nor depth, nor any other power could separate us from God's love. And he knows that because we killed God. And God returned to us in forgiving love. Ooh, talk about the door opening up. That's the door that opens up. Grace, call it. Revelation, call it. But it's the moment when the supreme manifestation of the divine love that went all the way down. I think that's the essence of Christianity. That's when they said good news, that's what they meant.
And this, of course, is the prerequisite for human beings being sinful creatures who sinned against God, absolving themselves and finding forgiveness. It seems like there's a condition here, though, of course.
No, there's...
In the Christian story, God becomes man and is crucified,
There's necessity.
and through this
What?
saves us from our sin, but it's conditional upon something like accepting this gift.
This is so
something
hard.
like...
Well, sure. I mean, you can lead a horse to water. I mean, God can open up the window and manifest his love in his utter way, and there's an objectivity there, for sure. But then I can,
This is so
at
bad.
the limit, say, I still don't care. I'd rather live inside. I'd rather live on my own
This
terms.
will
I'd rather
always
not
be
have
the
anything
hardest
outside.
part of Tartarus.
Sure, and that's the ground, if you want, of the Christian doctrine
If this ever
hell,
becomes not
that it's still
the hardest
possible
part,
to reject
I will
even that
fucking-
acrobatic manifestation of the divine love.
I
can
don't
still
know,
say,
I will start fucking believing in God if this part ever gets like easier than any other part. This shit part. It's only hard because I'm weak. What? Fuck this part.
I want it. So that's what that would mean, so sure, that's still a possibility.
Well, what I wanted to ask is, what are the conditions upon which a person can accept this gift? I mean, suppose somebody's commits some terrible sins in their lives and they've wronged lots of people. Is it enough to genuinely repent to God in the privacy of your own mind? Must you go on a campaign of trying to right the wrongs that you've done where you can? I mean, if you thieve from somebody and you, nearing the end of your life perhaps, you pray towards God and you beg for his forgiveness and you accept the sacrifice of Jesus, is that sufficient, or do you have to seek out the person that you thieved from and give them their money back first?
You should. I mean, so that's a part of confession. If someone comes to me and confesses,
It was
I wanna know
easy
that
the
person's
previous
contrite.
session.
So are they sincere in their confession? And are they willing to make amends or reparation? Sure, that's something I strongly encourage them to do. But the divine offer of grace is not dependent upon that. Like, until you do the last thing, you don't get any grace. Rather, it's a response to grace. It's having been graced with God's forgiveness. Of course, I want to do all I can to make up for what I've done. It's like someone at AA doing a searching moral inventory. And having done that work, now let me do whatever I can
It's
to
always
make
fucking
reparation.
happens in Tartarus.
But the heart of it, though, is the manifestation of grace. It's an
Can my
unmerited grace.
consistency just be fucking stable?
I don't think, Alex, is
Consistent.
behind a lot of the doctrinal language, let's say around the cross.
So that I don't have to
We
kill
got
myself.
like a high doctrinal articulation like Anselm's, cur deus homo. But see, go behind that to a metaphor, and behind the metaphor to an experience. The metaphor is something like, I've been ransomed. So in the ancient world, people were kidnapped all the time and held for ransom, and there they were in some distant country in a hopeless situation. They'll never get home, and then suddenly this person paid off my ransom. I was released, Now go behind that to the their experience of Jesus crucified and risen from the dead. It's like I've been delivered. Well, from what? From the fear, from Peterson's articulation. I've been liberated from everything that I'm terrified of, because now I know that God is powerful. So it's like being redeemed. Now, take the next step. I start articulating that in a high doctrinal way. Okay, so
Just because my hand is weak.
And if I was redeemed, I was bought back. Well, who paid the price and who got the... Well, sure, now you can work into Anselm's thing. But I'd go behind that to the more primordial experience of it. They experience the risen Jesus as a liberation. Salvation just means healing. I've been healed. I've been healed of every wound I've ever had. By his wounds, I've been healed. All of that. I've been straightened out. St. Paul, I've been justified, right? It's another metaphor. I've been straightened out. I was all crooked and mixed up. Now I'm straightened out. So they reach for this array of metaphors, which then later get into high doctrinal disputes. Now go to Luther in the 16th century fighting with Catholics over what does justification mean. But I'm more interested now with you in saying, well, the first Christians, they reach for these. Some forensic, some medical, some economic metaphors to express what it was like
How many fucking
to
attempts
see
did
the
this take?
risen Christ. I think that's where it all comes from.
Jeffrey Dahmer, famously near the end of his life, became a Christian, at least ostensibly, studied the Gospels, saw a priest, and shortly after was murdered by a fellow
This
inmate.
is not a death.
What do you make of the
When he
objection
said this
to
to
Christianity
33.
that as long as he was sincere in his repentance, a man like Jeffrey Dahmer can end up in heaven, but a person who lives their lives not harming a soul, who doesn't find Jesus near the end of their life and dies an atheist, might end up in hell?
Well, first, as a Catholic, I contest that second side of the dilemma, because we wouldn't put it that way. I mean, we would say that even an atheist who's sincerely following his or her conscience can be saved.
I don't believe what he's saying.
So that's teaching of Vatican II. So we wouldn't hold to that. And someone like Dahmer, that's a case like, he's a very extreme case, obviously, but that's been posed over the century. Let's say I don't know what's going on inside of Jeffrey Dahmer's soul, but if with complete sincerity and real repentance he opened his heart to the forgiveness of God, he received the forgiveness of God.
Nice.
Now, let's say Dahmer lived another,
me.
30 years, and I was a spiritual director, or confessor, I would urge him in every possible way to make reparation for what he had done. I always think of that scene in The Mission. Remember Robert De Niro, who was this, terrible slave trader, and finally he comes to an experience of forgiveness. But he himself demanded that he bear this terrible load all through the jungle and up and down the mountains. And even his friends were saying, "Come on, you've done enough." And no, I've not done enough. And only when he knew that he had done enough was he able to let it down. That's a good spiritual instinct.
Okay.
It's also reflected in the doctrine of purgatory, right? That even after we die,
I
is there
feel like
some
I'm the best player.
work that
the
needs
worst
to be done?
at the same
Yeah,
time.
99% of us, I would say. So I guess I would deny the two. I deny one side of that dilemma.
Oh my
I
god.
don't think the atheist ipso facto automatically goes to hell. No.
I find it
And how many
sounds strange to
Christians
say,
there
but I
are?
find it quite reassuring to think of a man like Jeffrey Dahmer in heaven. I think it demonstrates the radical compassion of the figure of Jesus, because if Jeffrey
Alright,
Dahmer
you know what?
can receive
I
grace
never
and end
did
up in heaven,
this.
then what
but
does
I'm
that say
going
about
to
the
do
rest
this.
of us? It gives me
Yeah.
a sense of calm, that no matter what I do wrong, as a Christian, if I were a Christian, I could think like, if that compassion really is on offer to everybody, then it has to be on offer to someone like him. And I think it reassures, but you can understand why it might be seen as a problem. I mean, for example, if someone were to wrong me, somebody were to thieve from me or mistreat me, and then they petition for God's forgiveness and God forgives them, I might say, well, look, that's not God's right, that's mine. If somebody wrongs me, then the person to whom they should be turning for forgiveness is me, and if I don't grant it, they don't get it. Why is it that God essentially seems to be able to grant forgiveness on the behalf of other people?
Well, first of all, he should do that vis-a-vis you. And if I were a spiritual director, I'd tell him to do that. But I'd say this with C.S. Lewis, your countryman, that
Right.
God is the one who's offended in every sin. So God has a right to forgive anybody, because someone sins against you, but they're also sinning against God by that very same move. So it's always God's prerogative to forgive. Only God can forgive sin, say the people around
Wait,
Jesus.
I died from that from 0.
That's dead right.
I
Only
have to
God
pay
can forgive
attention
sin.
so do not die on
Because
that
he's the
again.
one offended in every sin. But I
Because
would
that's a
encourage that person,
syndrome,
hypothetically, to
might be.
seek your forgiveness too.
Of course, it seems
That was very
troubling that a person who commits these wrongs can get to heaven. There's a caricature of this position
can't believe
of
it.
imagining the person who lives their life doing essentially whatever their animal instincts drive them to do, and then at the end of their life says, sorry God,
How
and
am I dying to
then,
that?
enters
Whatever.
into heaven. I remember there was an episode of Family Guy where they bust
Osama
into the
bin
compound and they find Osama bin Laden, and he says, I accept Jesus as my
Right.
Lord and Savior, and then yes, he's in heaven.
Right.
And
Right.
of course, this is ridiculous, but it summarizes, I think, the idea that even if a person is genuinely sorry, it's not quite on the order of just being like, sorry, whoops,
Right.
they have to actually believe it in their heart, but it seems like they haven't done enough to overcome what they've done in their life.
Hence
and warrant
purgatory on our reading. That's why purgatory to me is not at all a trivial doctrine. It's one that honors just
Like
what
in
you're
Tom
talking
and Jerry.
That's why, like life after death, too, is a way of honoring the passion for justice. Because let's face it, in this life, occasionally, justice breaks out. But typically it doesn't. Some of the worst people succeed. Some of the best people suffer. And so, and then we all just die like animals and go in the ground, and that's it. Well, then there is no justice. There is no justice at all. And then why not just live the way, any materialist would tell me to live? Belief in life after death is correlated to a great passion for justice. But
Not
there's some
true.
order of being
Not
in
true.
which God will set
Autism is correlated with a great sense of justice.
things right. And purgatory then is an ingredient in that idea too. That right, if it's just like Osama bin Laden in Family Guy, well then that guy's no more ready for heaven than the man on the moon.
Look.
So what he would require, in fact, is all kinds of purgation of his attachments, etc., etc. It's the good thief is a much better example, right? So someone who's presumably led a pretty bad life, and he ends up nailed to a Roman cross because he's a common thief. But certainly in the gospel reading summons the spiritual integrity, to reach out to Jesus in great sincerity of heart. And to him is said, today you'll be with me in paradise. So I mean, I get that. The Osama bin Laden would be the guy that needs an awful
Why?
purgatory.
Yeah, I mean, purgatory is something that I don't know very much about, and I don't know what the Catholic Church's official stance is on purgatory at the moment.
If someone dies,
Does it have one?
yeah. If someone dies in the good grace of God, meaning someone dies, in a state of grace, but yet in need of purgation, which means about 99% of us. There's a state of reality in which one is
Can you
purged of one's attachments and sins and so on.
What?
So it's a being readied for heaven. See, think of it this way. Mother Teresa taking care of the sick and dying in Calcutta is essentially in heaven, because heaven means a place of radical love. Suppose somebody who's just lived a completely hedonistic life is sent to Calcutta to live with Mother Teresa's sisters and do their work. He'd be in hell. I mean, he'd find that utterly, unbearably awful, right? He would require enormous amount of purgation to ready himself to live the life that
I
in
thought it
fact
was
is a
that.
heavenly life. But he's in no way ready for it. So something like that, I think, is essential to the doctrine of purgatory.
So you can die like that, I never knew.
Christopher Hitchens once described purgatory as a disposal problem. I think he saw it as this idea of having an intuition that there are people who die. In particular, I think unborn fetuses are referenced here. If somebody has an abortion, on the Catholic view, of course, life begins at conception, and so you have a human being who hasn't had the opportunity to commit sins, but also hasn't had the opportunity to
what am I
accept
doing?
the gift of Jesus, but they end up in this place called purgatory.
What?
So he characterizes it as a place that's invented to solve this problem. Is there a
I just
scriptural,
don't understand
biblical
those
basis for purgatory?
deaths.
Do you think that there's a good general philosophical grounds for this idea of purgatory, or do you think it is something that you essentially have to believe, because otherwise you run into the problem of what happens to such people?
Well, no, that last point you made is in a way the philosophical ground. As we reflect on the dynamics at play here, people say, well, yeah, it would make sense there'd be such a state.
I thought it was
Otherwise, God's justice is not going to obtain. What you're describing there, if it's Hitchens' view, is not so much purgatory as limbo. And limbo, the church held at certain points in history. Most recently, it kind of suspended that and said, no, we entrust, let's say, a aborted child or an infant child to the mercy of God, and we leave it at that. So that's closer to limbo than purgatory, because purgatory is not.
Yeah, no, I think it might have been limbo he was talking about in the quote that I'm thinking of in the
I
Catholic Church.
thought
Mix that up with purgatory there.
Because
Actually.
I'm
purgatory
such
is a
dumbhead
transient
for
state
not
of
having his
preparation.
start position at
It's meant to be a time
96.
of preparation.
Cause that shit fucking
You know,
sucks.
with the Divine
Oh
Comedy,
my god.
Dante, of course, is so perceptive about everything. But a lot of the central
What?
part of that book, the Purgatorio,
Get fucking real.
is the
Where
purging
are
away
you?
of the 7 deadly sins, hence the 7-story mountain of purgatory.
Blech.
And on each one, Dante has them engaging in what
Indeed,
Jung
it's
called the
disgusting.
non-theodromia. They have to do the opposite of what they did in life. So the prideful, who are always lifting themselves up, were pressed down by great rocks. The envious, who looked out at the world all the time, who's better than I am and who's getting more attention, they have their eyelids sewn shut. And so in his poetic imagination, it's the way of saying you have to just agere contra, as Ignatius said. You have to act against whatever your tendency is.
I don't
So
know
something
what
like
now,
that,
it's
I think,
just-
reasonably obtains as a preparation for the fullness of love that heaven is.
So why not, if nearing the end of your life you can apologize, and as long as you do so sincerely, find your way at least to purgatory and potentially to heaven, why not console yourself or consign yourself to a life of
Why?
hedonism and base pleasure, and just wait until your deathbed to really contemplate these ideas? Wouldn't it be rational
No.
for a person to
that's-
put that off for as long as they can?
No, that's childish, because in fact the life you're
You just won't be able to change your mind. Like, how can you? It's just not possible. There's not enough free will for that to be possible, Alex. Even I have to agree with this guy.
describing is a terrible life, and is a painful life, and a life that leaves you both physically, emotionally, and spiritually in a destitute condition. And so to say, oh, I'm going to do all that in the last minute is just counterproductive. If you want to start right now living a life that's joyful and spiritually alert and all that. So no, that would be silly.
I have one more question for you, which is, what do you think young people in particular get wrong about religion and belief in God?
But it's for old and gullible people.
They imagine God as a competitive being. The roots of that philosophically are very interesting, and they're deep. To imagine God as a being. I think it was Hitchens who said, religious people believe that the world is like a cosmic North Korea. There's this terrible tyrant who's surveilling
That's tight!
a being in Tom McQueen.
Too tight for such a simple level.
He's sheer actuality.
Irrational.
And he's not competing therefore on the
wrong.
psychological plane with creatures. It's not
Wrong
the case
button.
that as God gets all the glory, I get no glory. As God gets all the attention, I
Why
have to
don't I have
denigrate.
this
On
start
the
position right
contrary,
before the swing
it's what
copter?
St. Irenaeus said. The glory of God is a human being fully alive. What God wants is for me to be alive.
Why did we all
spiritually
donate
alive
so?
in every way That's the
That's
image
too
of the
much.
burning bush, right? It's on fire
That
but
is
not
not
consumed.
downward.
That's what God wants vis-a-vis his creation. And I think young people get wrong. They do the Hitchens thing. That God is a terrible tyrant that's surveying and ready to pounce and to judge. No, God is the source of all value and is the source of life, the living God who wants me to be like him, to be alive as he's alive.
How did I? First of all, how
that's
did I
the
die?
mistake that a lot
Second
of
of all,
people,
how did I
especially
hit
young
the shift
people,
button?
Watch George Carlin sometime. You know, I liked in many ways that George Carlin, coming out of his Catholic training of his era, but this horrible view of God as this desperately punishing tyrant. That's not the great tradition at all about God. So maybe
I
sounds like
don't.
You understand why people... You might understand why Christopher Hitchens describes God as a tyrant, because of course,
Because they fucking read the Old Testament.
you know, God is
And it's
is the
considered
great
Bible.
ground of all being, but there's this idea that if you don't accept this, or if you put a foot wrong, or if you do the wrong thing, you get punished, and in such a way that even if you do it inside your own head, you have this force that can punish you for it. It doesn't seem tyrannical to you.
Yeah, that does, but that's not the right way to look at it, because see, here's something very important for God doesn't need us. God needs nothing. God is God. The world adds nothing.
Yeah, exactly. He needs fucking nothing, yet he creates us and demands something from us.
That's great. It's a very important
Incredible.
theological idea. God doesn't need my moral perfection. God doesn't need anything from me. God needs nothing from me.
Why do you need
God's
God?
offended by what no, that's a psychologized sort of symbol of what we're talking about. God, the anger of God in the Bible, I would translate it, God's passion to set things right. God hates the fact that I'm not alive. And he hates what I've done to myself. And he wants that over. He wants to burn that away. And so the divine anger, the divine punishment, if we psychologize it as some, Kim Jong-un punishing his rivals, that's not it at all. It's God desiring, in fact, going all the way into our dysfunction, all the way down, so he might draw us out of it. That's the divine anger. That's why, people say on the cross, we're judged. Well, yeah, sin is judged on the cross. Sin is judged. God went all the way.
No, wait, what? You can be too early. I forgot. I thought you can be too late.
So that's the problem. Now, look, I'll grant to you, there have been a lot of lousy teachers of Christianity over the centuries. Think of James Joyce's teachers in Ireland. And they're terrible. And they took this genius kid. They gave him some beautiful scholastic philosophy, and he took that all his life. But they also gave him this sort of poisonous understanding of God. Or Christopher Hitchens, he wasn't Catholic, I don't think, but would have taken in some very bad Christian instruction, it seems to me.
Offensive. That's offensive.
But then there are these marvelous teachers in our tradition that we should pay attention to.
Yeah, and I would recommend the same. Yeah, it's interesting to think on that, the idea of human beings not giving anything to God, or not being able to take anything away from God. For me, I think that the problem with tyranny is the tyrant.
Yeah.
The reason why tyranny is bad, the reason why it's bad to have an authoritarian dictator, is because of the corruptibility of human beings. It seems to me that if there were a person or being who genuinely knew you better than you yourself, genuinely wanted the best for you, and genuinely knew how to get the best for you, then it would be perfectly irrational for you to not do what they say all the time.
Right.
And that this shouldn't be described as tyranny, but rather something like genuine, enlightened advice that you would be foolish not to take.
Right. That's why the psalmist can say, Lord, I love your law. I meditate on it day and night. The law's not some imposition on me. I love your law. It's like when you're learning how to play golf and someone's giving you proper instruction and it's getting into your body and now you know how to hit the down ball. I love the law. Give me more of it. Give me more of the law. I thought it was fucking dead
a long time ago.
And if I'm living just in my own space, I'm going to golf any way I want to. I'll be the worst golfer in the world, right? So that's a better metaphor for like religious law. And that's why when the Lord says, I will write the law in your heart, that's like a golfer. I finally got it in my body. I finally have the laws in my body. So that's what God wants to do.
How did I die?
In my heart.
Yeah,
no,
it's like
silly.
a wonderful and strangely paradoxical sense in which you can become more free or more enabled by restricting your behaviour.
Quite
Much
right.
like how by restricting yourself from going to smoke some cigarettes,
Right.
in a sense, you actually become more free by restricting
Quite
the
right.
amount of things
Yeah.
that you can
And
do.
see, freedom is a great spiritual metaphor up and down the tradition because our attachments make us unfree. And when I'm freed from my attachments, I'm freed for that thing we first talked about. This realm of objective values begins to open up to me in a fresh way. As long as I'm in my
I
little
thought I
world and I'm
died
hung
to
up
the
on how do people
UFO.
think about me and how am I doing,
I actually did, but
then
not
I never,
when I
the world of
expected
objective
it to
value
happen.
doesn't open up to me. It's like light pollution. You don't see the stars. But when I get rid of all that clutter and distraction, I can actually see the stars.
And this is what the tyrant of Christopher Hitchens' description is actually doing. It's not do this or else I'm going to punish you, but do this because this is the right thing for you.
Trust me, do this and things will clear away
Oh my god.
that will enable you, a whole world to open up to you. That would be the right way to read it.
Well, Bishop Barron, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Delighted to be with you, Alex. Thank you for having me again.
Did you enjoy that conversation?
Pretty much.
You must have done at least a little bit because you seem to have made it to the end. If you made it to the end of that one, you can perhaps make it to the beginning of the next.
Wait a bit, Alex. I'm really focused. That's bad trajectory. That's what? No! If that continues, so we need to, yes, put a checkpoint at the wave. Because that won't do. Alright, that changes my pattern a bit, this kiddo. This guy was... well, obviously he wasn't smart because he was religious. I'm not sure if smart is... No, not like that. He wasn't genuine, he wasn't honest with himself. Yeah, this. Other than that, I think... yeah, pretty smart, just not honest. I will say I liked him. He's a good guy. I would like him to be my uncle or something. There's gonna be music in the background. If so, then it's bad.
Here lies Eric Arthur Blair, a man who had such a deep impact on 20th century political writing that his surname has become
But I have no
a
choice,
metonym
because I
for
really want to
dystopia.
listen to this.
And no, I'm not talking about Blairism. If you're wondering why I've driven 30 minutes to visit the grave of a man who you perhaps have never even heard of, you may be more familiar with the pen name that he wrote under, George Orwell. And perhaps a graveyard is a fitting place to open today's video, in which I want to talk about Orwell's views on a tragedy that he perceived as far back as 1946, the death of the English language. Orwell was first and foremost a political writer with a particular care for clarity of language, which he felt was a necessary precondition for clarity of thought. So much of political disaster, as he saw it, can be attributed to the lack of this crucial component in our thinking and our speaking and our writing. Orwell's most celebrated work, of course, 1984, is in many ways a book about language and how its erosion has a corrupting influence not only on the way that we communicate, but also on the way that we think, and especially the way that we think about politics. Say what you will about the state of modern political discourse, you'll have a hard time arguing that it's characterized by clarity or lack of ambiguity, and this is what Orwell was so terrified of. It's something of a trope to recognize that the English language is in decline and to complain about the fact that the newer generations are corrupting it so carelessly. But the good news is that Orwell thought that there was something we can do about this, and in fact gave us some very specific tips on how we can avoid this erosion of our thinking and of our writing, and how we can aim to be much more clear in the discussion of political topics. Today, of course, Orwell is mostly remembered for his works of fiction, but he also has an expansive corpus of essays. One in particular, called Politics and the English Language, written in 1946, is one of the most insightful commentaries on this subject of language available in print, even to this day. And so today we're going to explore that essay and the tips that he gives to writing more clearly and discover why it is that Orwell is still remembered, even now, as one of the clearest and most intelligent writers of the 20th century. Orwell begins his essay by providing some examples of bad modern English. In order to fix our writing, of course, we need an idea of what it is that's going wrong. Here's one example that he cites, written by Harold Lasky. I am not, indeed, sure whether it is not true to say that Milton, who once seemed not unlike a 17th century Shelley, had not become, out of an experience ever more bitter in each year, more alien to the founder of that Jesuit sect, which nothing could induce him to tolerate. Got that? Of course not. What on earth did that sentence mean? This kind of lack of clarity is something that Orwell thought was found all over political discourse, and he thought that it always shared two problems in particular. The first, he writes, is staleness of imagery. The other is lack of precision. Let's talk first about staleness of imagery. One of the most helpful ways to convey a message is to use metaphor and simile, creating unique mental images to illustrate a point. Orwell quotes Ecclesiastes as an example of brilliant use of imagery. I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, neither yet bread to the wise, nor yet riches to men of understanding, nor yet favour to men of skill, but time and chance happeneth to them all. A beautiful way, I think you'll agree, to express the idea that luck, rather than skill, is often the reason why people are successful.
This is
To show what so often goes wrong in modern writing, Orwell translates this passage into what he calls modern English of the worst sort. Objective considerations of contemporary phenomena compel the conclusion that success or failure in competitive activities exhibits no tendency to be commensurate with innate capacity, but that a considerable element of the unpredictable must invariably be taken into account. This says the same thing as the original biblical passage, but it's far more stale, far less eloquent, and indeed far less convincing than the original. Because it's a circus of unnecessary...
This is not a part
devoid of imagery in an attempt to feign
to
sophistication.
include into level of this
The same point
difficulty.
made, the lack of imagery,
It is not firework!
and riches to men of understanding is lost. And it's exactly this kind of imagery that makes Ecclesiastes such an eloquent book. Orwell's second complaint, you'll remember, is lack
This shit
of
must be
precision.
easier in 2.2.
This is something we can find all over
Because
modern
UFO
writing
jumps
and
not
speaking.
so much.
In politics, consider how instead of saying,
Fuck.
I made a mistake, politicians will often say something more like, undeniably, departmental mistakes were made in the process of decision-making which will be addressed as a matter of urgency. Or perhaps you felt that nagging feeling that regardless of how many times an interviewer asks a question, a politician just seems ludicrously incapable of giving what
Exactly.
we might call a straight answer.
You threatened to
I
overrule.
was not entitled to instruct Derek Lewis, and I did not instruct him. And
Did you threaten to overrule
the
him?
truth of the matter is that Mr.
So
Marriott
close,
was
like
not
120
suspended.
FPS
I
from
did not
perfect.
Overrule him.
I
Has
did
been
not
caught.
overrule Derek
Did you
Lewis.
threaten to overrule him?
I took advice on what I could or could not
Did
do,
you threaten
and I
to overrule him,
acted
Mr. Howard?
scrupulously
I mean,
in
have been
accordance with
caught.
that advice.
I
did
couldn't
not
stop
overrule
thinking
Derek
about
Lewis.
that grammatical
Mr.
mistake.
Marriott was not suspended.
Did you threaten to overrule him?
I have a
I'm sorry, I'm
counter
going to be
business.
frightfully rude, but,
Yes, you
but
can-
sorry.
The defining quality of such speech is, as Orwell says, lack of precision. I would add that this kind of writing and speaking also extends to academia, especially, I hate to have to say it, in the humanities. The social sciences in particular are often accused of containing large swaths of essentially meaningless words strung mindlessly together.
Exactly.
Here's a
Fuck.
sometimes cited example of a single sentence from an essay by the philosopher Judith Butler. The move from a structuralist account in which capital is understood to structure social relations in relatively homologous ways to a view of hegemony in which power relations are subject to repetition, convergence, and rearticulation brought the question of temporality into the thinking of structure and marked a shift from a form of Althuserian theory that takes structural tonalities as theoretical objects to one in which the insights into the contingent possibility of structure inaugurate a renewed conception of hegemony as bound up with the contingent sites and strategies
She's just
of the
autistic, that's
rearticulation
fine.
of power. How very insightful. This meaningless verbiage by a professor at Berkeley was actually published in a real scholarly journal, and I think is exactly the kind of writing that would have made George Orwell start to uncontrollably vomit. Luckily, though, Orwell has helpfully specified 4 things to avoid in your own writing and speaking in order to prevent the kind of unclarity that we've seen in these examples. 4 things to resist in particular, and here they are. First, dying metaphors. Genuinely fresh metaphors are a crucial tool, evoking a
I
visual
wanna
image to
die.
help make a point. Orwell compares these with dead metaphors, those which have been so overused that they actually cease to be metaphors altogether, and instead begin to function like ordinary words. Consider referring to something as brand new. Brand new. Originally, this refers to a brand or firebrand, implying the immediate newness of something just forged in a fire. Saying brand new thus evoked an image, one that simply isn't evoked anymore. Now it's just a plain phrase, functioning like any other ordinary word. To be clear, dead metaphors, like brand new, are fine to use, specifically because they are dead. They now function like ordinary words. What we should avoid, according to Orwell, is not dead metaphors, but dying metaphors. Somewhere between alive and dead, no longer fresh enough to be insightful, but not quite dead enough to function as a common word. These are metaphors that someone, somewhere, cleverly devised a long time ago, but have now passed into common parlance, meaning that they no longer strike the reader or listener as interesting. Orwell's own examples of dying metaphors are, of course, a bit dated, being from the 40s, but one of the examples he gave was the phrase, "shoulder to shoulder with." Such a metaphor is unoriginal and overused, and is perhaps best described as a cliché. It's boring. Your eyes or ears gloss over it without it having the evocative effect it was originally intended. When a country's leader boldly states that we will stand shoulder to shoulder with our allies,
I thought it was dead.
the sentence isn't nearly as powerful as it would have been
I thought it was
when
dead.
such a metaphor was genuinely original. Now it's just quite boring and common to hear. Another example Orwell gives is toe the line. When you hear this phrase, do you
I
imagine
just
them
can't!
alongside each other at the beginning of a foot
I'm
race?
just too weak
Probably
for
not.
this part.
Orwell notes that
I
in this
spent
case,
so
the
many
original
fucking
imagery has
attempts in my
become
life
so
trying
lost
to
that this
master
phrase
it.
is often even shortened
Nothing
to toe the
came
line
out of it.
with a W. The imagery is
You
set
just
of
cannot get
off
better
the
at that.
is
It
dying.
requires
I
you
think
to
that
get
some
fucking
recent
reborn.
examples of dying metaphors might include a rule of
Ah!
or skating on thin ice. Dying metaphors are, says Orwell, merely used because they save people the trouble of inventing phrases for themselves. The effect is that modern writing, quote,
I do.
does not consist in picking out words for the sake of their meaning and inventing images in order to make the meaning clearer. It consists in gumming together long strips of words which have already been set in order by someone else and making the result presentable by sheer humbug. So, stop using dying metaphors that someone else came up with and everyone else uses. Try some new ones, all of your own. This will make your writing far more interesting. Second is what Orwell calls operators or verbal false limbs. He phrases this a bit weirdly, but this one is essentially an issue of economy. Instead of using
What?
the perfectly good word break,
Why
a
did I
person may write
die?
render inoperative.
What for?
Instead of saying
Oh
fight,
my god, do
they
you know
might
that
say
it could have been 6 to
militate
100?
against. It describes this kind of language
Literally.
as turning a verb into a whole phrase when it's unnecessary to do so. Other examples he gives include
Imagine
be
6 to
subjected
100.
to, play a
Flipping from
leading
like
part
6
in,
to
and exhibit
6
a
to
tendency
13.
Such phrases may sound sophisticated,
I know.
but when going for clarity, Orwell thinks that we should always use one word instead of many whenever we can. I myself, for what it's worth, am not sure that I agree with Orwell here. I think this kind of writing is okay, so long as clarity is not hindered by a little bit of verbal dressing. Orwell also
Wow.
notes in this section something which today we can recognise as an obsession of politicians, which is speaking in the passive rather than the active voice. This is the difference between saying, I made a mistake, which is active, and mistakes were made, which is passive. A subtle distinction, but when the passive voice is overused, it renders a speech completely detached and impersonal. So Orwell thinks that wherever possible, we should be using the active voice rather than the passive. Thirdly, in this section, Orwell advises against the not-un formation, saying something like not uncommonly instead of the far easier commonly. When criticised, a politician won't say the claims are founded, but rather the claims are not unfounded. This allows the speaker or writer to disguise uncomfortable admissions in ambiguous phrasing, and something that, for the sake of clarity, we ought to avoid. So, always prioritise clarity and don't use more words when less will do. This is Orwell's second piece of advice to you. Third, pretentious diction. Of course, this will depend on the context, but frankly, try
This
not
guy
to be
is probably
pretentious.
also autistic.
And before you run to the comments to call me a pretentious hypocrite, bear in mind that Orwell is talking here about literally putting up a pretense, using words inappropriately or falsely. For example, Orwell resents how words like objective or categorical are, quote,
What?
dress up a simple statement and give an air of scientific impartiality to biased judgments. Consider, for example, when someone claims that we need to follow the science, when in other a person is really advocating for a biased
I
personal
thought it was
judgment,
that.
an interpretation of data, not some objective scientific fact. Yet they will still label their views
That never happened before.
Continues by noting that when writing about international politics, we say things like
What?
historic, inevitable, and unprecedented, when oftentimes the subject matter is, in fact, not any of these things. When talking about war, and keep in mind that this essay was published just after World War II, writing takes on an archaic colour, according to Orwell, using words like realm, and trident, sword and shield, and jackboot. In an even more egregious pretense, we might refer to
I
a
hate
war
that
as
so
an
much.
intervention, or an invasion as an operation. Orwell also uses this section to advise against unnecessarily using foreign words where English ones will do. I should add that this obviously only applies when you're actually writing in English. Orwell cites phrases like cul-de-sac and status quo as being pretentious, but again these are dated examples, since nowadays these are actually extremely common staples of English discourse. Orwell isn't against the use of foreign words. Of course, our entire language has roots all over the globe, but if a foreign word is being used just for the sake of sounding fancy or
Like
scientific, when
Dostoevsky.
there's actually a perfectly good commonly used alternative in the English language, that's just a bit annoying, I think you'll agree. But I do have a feeling that Orwell would agree with my stipulation here, which is that in many cases, in my view, there are foreign words whose specific
I'm
meaning
going
has
to
no direct
hurt myself.
translation and is therefore best left untouched. But again, Orwell's key advice here is to avoid vagueness. Fourth, meaningless meaningless
I'm being
words.
tortured.
But Orwell is specifically advising against using words that don't have a specific definition. Using words that can mean something completely different to different listeners without actually specifying what you intend it to mean. Here's
Good
a
girl.
quote from
My
his essay.
keyboard
The
is
word
far away.
fascism has now
No.
no meaning except insofar as it signifies something not
Right, I got it
desirable.
closer.
The words democracy, socialism, freedom,
how
patriotic,
fucking none.
realistic,
Because I
justice
lost my
have each
focus.
of them several different meanings which cannot be reconciled with one another. In the case of a word like democracy, not only is there no agreed definition, but the attempt to make one is resisted from all sides. It's almost universally felt that when we call a country democratic, we are progressive. Consequently, the defenders of every kind of regime claim that it is a democracy and fear that they might have to stop using that word if it were tied down to any one meaning. How very relatable. Now, Orwell also notes that many people use such words in a deliberately dishonest way.
Oh,
get
get honest.
Claims which they can defend as honest because they didn't mean what they said, but that they know are misleading. Imagine a priest
This
saying,
gameplay is
"The Catholic
misleading.
Church is opposed to persecution." Okay, sure, but we clearly just have different definitions of what counts as persecution. Another of Orwell's examples, the Soviet press is the freest in the world. Okay, fine, but I have a feeling
Which is
that you've got a
complete lie.
slightly more paternalistic conception of what freedom means than I do. The same thing, of course, happens in politics all the time, when a politician says, I would never do anything to harm the country. There's the question as to what harming the country means in the first place. Of course, what they're doing is something that they don't think is going to harm the country. But the whole argument is whether the thing they're doing is harmful at all. The definition of harmful is something that needs to be specified in order for the sentence to
I'm
even
having
make
so much
sense.
fucking fun,
If
I
these
wanna
words
die.
are not strictly defined, then they are, in a sense, meaningless. They have no unifying meaning. This is exactly how we end up with the United States, the Netherlands, and North Korea all claiming to be democratic. Similarly, if a traditionalist community is accused of misogyny, they might say, no, we care deeply for the welfare of our women. I don't
120
doubt
frame
that they
perfect.
genuinely do, but they probably have a different idea of what a woman's welfare consists in. Unless we specify precisely what it is that we're actually talking about, we will always run into avoidable
I
ambiguity.
never thought
So
that I'm
then,
so
the way to
unskilled.
avoid meaningless words is to precisely define what it is that you're talking about, wherever you suspect that there might be some potential ambiguity. These, then, are always 4 things to avoid: dying metaphors, false verbal limbs, pretentious diction, and meaningless words. Helpfully, Orwell condenses his points into 6 easy-to-follow rules whenever you're writing an essay or speech. 1. Never use a metaphor, simile, or other figure of speech which you're used to seeing in print. 2. Never use a long word where a short one will do. 3. If it is possible to cut out a word, always cut it out. 4. Never use the passive where you can use the active. 5. Never use a foreign phrase, a scientific word, or a jargon word if you can think of an everyday English equivalent. And 6, perhaps most importantly, break any of these rules sooner than say anything outright barbarous. I've already mentioned that I personally distrust some of the advice that Orwell gives in this essay, but that final rule of his seems to recognise that there is some scope for legitimate disagreement about the points that he raises. I would highly recommend reading it for yourself. I'll leave a link in the description. But just bear in mind, if you do read it, that it was written in the 40s, and so the for the modern reader.
Alright,
You can
actually,
easily fill in
no, I don't
examples
have
of
the
your own.
3
Reading
ones because I died
politics and the English
here.
language, I get the impression that I myself have a bit more admiration for, shall we say, flair and linguistic indulgence than Orwell did. But then I'm not really a political writer, as Orwell was, and whenever I'm aiming at perfect clarity, I'm much more likely to follow the rules. At any rate, we can be sure that the people I quoted at the beginning of this video could certainly have done with listening to Mr. Eric Blair. By heeding his warning, we might be able to protect our language against a decline in clarity and meaning, something he warned us about most extremely with 1984. And given that Orwell's writing is still today a staple of our culture, he must have been getting something right. Now, there is something else that Orwell himself never wrote about protecting.
You just
Because
relax
he
your
died
hand
before
and then it
existed,
works.
but I like to think that if he were still alive, he'd care about it too. And that something is your internet security. That's
Don't worry. Don't worry about that.
For a man who titled the 10th chapter of his 12 Rules for Life, Be Precise in... For a man who titled the 10th chapter of his 12 Rules for Life, Be Precise in Your Speech, Jordan Peterson seems ludicrously uninterested in his own advice anytime he's speaking on the topic of religion or belief in God. Now, granted, these aren't exactly the most straightforward areas of study known to man, so I wouldn't expect his views to be without detail and clarification. But in my view, Peterson tends to needlessly overcomplicate any question he has ever asked about God or religion to an extent that borders on the comic.
So people say to me, do you believe in God? And I think, okay, there's a couple of mysteries in that question. What do you mean do? What do you mean you? What do you mean believe? And what do you mean God? And you say as the question, well, we already know what all those things mean except belief in God. And I think, no, if we're going to get down to the fundamental brass tacks, We don't really know what any of those things mean.
So I want to take a moment to explain why, after having listened carefully to a great
Well, that's funny, but actually, he's right.
deal of his recent material on religion, and even going to see him talk about it in person, my takeaway is this. Jordan Peterson is what most people would call an atheist. He thinks that God is a fictional character, that the stories of religious scripture did not literally occur, and that the idea of God and stories about him are primarily a way for people to ground their value structures and provide social and psychological unity. Now, I do realise that Dr. Peterson himself would probably not be best pleased with that characterisation I've just given of him as an atheist, so allow me to take some time. Fair warning, it's going to get a bit wordy and complicated, but stick with me. I might be wrong, but I've tried my best to offer an account of what it is that Jordan Peterson actually thinks, before then offering some criticism. Of course, if I do get it wrong, then Dr. Peterson, you're always welcome on my podcast. To begin with, we have to start with a fundamental question. To Jordan Peterson, real or not, what is God? But just before jumping into that, a word from today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Morning Brew. Morning Brew is a free email newsletter that hits your inbox every
don't
single
need
morning,
any
Monday
Morning
through
Brew.
Sunday. It only takes about 15 seconds to sign up, and then every morning you'll be up to date with the latest in business, tech, and finance news. Most people, my past self included, start in a disorganized manner. Our phone is usually the first.
I'm sorry, I don't need any Morning Brew. What? You can frame by what? You can move the video frame by frame on YouTube? That's insane. Since when? Incredible. Best feature they've ever added.
Like what you hear, you can go to morningbrewdaily.com/cosmic skeptic, or click the link in the description, or even scan the QR code that's currently on your screen to sign up now. And if you do so, I'm confident that you won't regret it. So, back to it. To Jordan Peterson, what is God? To begin answering this, we need to understand Peterson's views about value. For Jordan Peterson, our ability to do just about anything requires a belief in some sort of value judgment. For example, even being able to do something as simple as looking at this glass, simply seeing a cup, requires the assumption of value judgments. And there are two reasons for this. The first is expressed by who appears to have had a huge impact on Peterson's thinking.
We can't perceive an is without a hierarchy of attention and without a hierarchy of perception, because the world is indefinite in detail and in quantity. And so for even to be able to say this, to point to something, to say that, is already in this hierarchy of something we call vertical causation.
So, first, there are a near infinite number of ways that we can see the world. We could look in all different directions, focus on multiple things. We can see things as parts or as wholes. And so to focus on one object at first requires an attention hierarchy.
The hierarchy of attention.
What's worth looking at? What do we value focusing on? But it goes even deeper. For Peterson, the very ability to even identify a cup as a distinguishable object requires a belief in certain values. If I put
Maybe
this cup
Peterson
on a
is
table,
right here.
why do I still see the cup and the table as two distinct objects? Why don't I perceive them as one big, weirdly shaped object? And why don't I
wanna
see
die?
this cup as multiple objects? The side, the bottom, the rim.
There are lots of
Why do I
buts
see it as one unified object when there are so many different ways
what
that we could
Peterson
look at it?
says. But
Well, here's
basically,
what Dr.
yes.
Peterson has to say.
If you were a photorealist painter, you could spend a month painting all the
You cannot
reflections.
die of that.
It's a very complex thing to perceive. But you
That's completely
perceive it as a
decent.
unity, and we know this neuropsychologically. We know this scientifically. You perceive it as a unity because you can grip it, and because you can raise it to your lips, and because you can drink it, and because you need to drink water to survive, and you are willing to drink water to survive because you believe emotionally and motivationally and perhaps rationally that survival is a good, and that's dependent on your belief that human existence in some sense is a good, and that it's striving towards some sort of higher unified order. And you might think, well, you don't need all that to perceive the glass, and the answer is Yeah, as a matter of fact, you need all of that to perceive the glass.
So, the reason my brain perceives this cup as a single object is functional. Because I can use this cup. Is because I want to drink.
How big do you have to be to fail like that?
To my survival. So I must in some sense value my survival in order to see the cup. So in order to perceive the world around us, according to Peterson, and objects within it, we need to believe in a hierarchy of values. But we don't just need to believe in this value hierarchy to see anything, we also need it in order to do anything. Here, Peterson gives the example of writing an essay.
I used to ask my students, why are you writing this essay? And that's a variation of the question, why do anything? But let's make it concrete. Why are you writing this essay? So that I can get a grade for the class.
But
Why are
actually,
you
that's
taking the
like,
class?
that's very good.
So that I can finish my year at university. Why are you finishing your year at university and motivated to do that? To get my degree. Why do you want the degree? And then that's a whole hierarchy of value that is definitely governing either in an integrated manner or a disintegrated
very
manner
good
the
timing.
actions of the person who's writing the essay.
So this is a little bit more straightforward. Whenever we do anything, someone can ask, why are you doing that? Why am I making this video right now? Well, so I can share my views with you. And why do I want to share my views with you? Or to contribute to a meaningful conversation. Well, why do I want to do that? Because I value such meaning, and so on and so forth. And this can go on up this hierarchy of things that I value until we get to the very top, the thing that we value most of all, upon which everything else is predicated. Okay, so in order to see anything or do anything, we must be motivated by some hierarchy of values. So here's an important question.
Stop,
Value
Hair.
hierarchy.
Stop.
What is the
Don't
fundamental
fall.
value upon which everything else is based? Here's where it gets really interesting.
And you might say, well, how hard are you going to try when you write this essay? And the answer to that is, well, it depends on how well integrated my view of the ethic is all the way up to the highest place.
Fuck.
And then we could say, well, the highest place is the divine place, and we could make that a matter of definition.
There it is. Did you catch that? It was so quick that you missed it if you blinked. But Jordan Peterson just told us what God is in his view. Listen again.
And then we could say, well, the highest place is the...
Basically, God for this guy is the strive to reproduce. Basically, he just calls the desire to reproduce to pass your genes. That desire he calls God. That's basically it. I see.
divine
Naruhodo.
place, and we could make that a matter of definition.
Very
The highest
convenient.
place, that is the highest place on this value hierarchy that we were just talking about, is the divine place. And we can make that a matter of definition. Wow. The word divine, of course, means of or relating to God.
That's
And
right.
Peterson has just told us that for him it's a simple matter of definition that the divine is just whatever value is at the highest place on the value hierarchy. So let's go back to that essay that we were talking about. Writing the essay
I thought
requires
I
a
was.
value
I
hierarchy.
thought.
Why are you writing the essay? To get a good grade. And why do you want the good grade? To get a good job. And why do you want the job? And so on and so forth up the value hierarchy. And Peterson says that we can simply take as a matter of definition that wherever we end up in the hierarchy, whatever happens to be at the
I'm
highest
gonna
place
fucking cry every
is
time
the
I die
divine.
there.
So what is the nature of this thing at the top of the
Maybe
value
my
hierarchy?
brain then remembers
What's
not
the
to do
exact
that
divine
ever.
place? How do we characterize it? Peterson's answer here is astonishing.
And so then we might say, well, what should be in the divine place?
Ah.
And I would say, well, it has to be something that you can look at the world through, and it has to be something you act out. And then we could say, well, that still leaves residual
Oh
risk.
my, how was
Then
I
we might ask, well, how
alive?
do we characterize it? I would say we characterize that using fiction. Because fiction is the abstraction of hierarchies of attentional prioritization and action. And so we could say that in the highest sense, in the biblical corpus, God is the ultimate fictional character.
Ding, ding, ding. One more time, please.
You could say that in the highest sense, in the biblical corpus, God is the ultimate fictional character.
God is a fictional character. God is the fictional
Oh!
of the highest value held by human beings. Let's break down how we got to where we are. Human beings simply find themselves unable to function without values. That's where we start. To see things or do things, we need to value things. Whatever the fundamental value is at the top of the value
Stop
chart
with this
is
part!
by definition, divine.
Or with my genetical incompatibility with this.
Of these values. And then Peterson adds just one more thing.
God is the ultimate
Change
fictional
my
character.
genes
And
so
then
that
we're
this
going to
part is
characterize
free.
his nature
I cannot, my hand cannot do this.
that unites us psychologically and socially.
So, in my view,
I thought
this
it
is the proof.
died.
Jordan Peterson is an atheist. He's just described God as a fictional character whose existence is simply a characterization of value made by the human mind for the purpose of scientifically and socially. This is exactly what atheists say. God does not exist as he is invented by the human mind. And the reason why the human mind invents God is to provide some psychological and social stability. If this is not atheism, then what is? So now we can understand that when Peterson talks about God, what he's really talking about is something like the fundamental value that human beings hold, whatever is at the top of their value hierarchy. Now we can begin to make sense of a lot of the things that Peterson has said in the past that seem bewildering upon first hearing. For example, listen to this clip from a recent Lex Friedman podcast.
Why?
Peterson uses the word secular here to mean something like non-religious.
Even secular people go to museums. I'm secular. Are you in a museum? Yes. Are you looking at art? Yes. Well, what makes you think you're secular then?
Hold on. What? The fact that you're in a museum looking at art means that you're not secular? Why on earth would somebody have to be religious to look at art? Well, if by God and divinity Peterson is simply referring to fundamental human value, then since to enjoy art requires some sense of valuing art or beauty, then of course you can't be secular and enjoy art. The problem, of course, is that this simply isn't what most people mean by God or divine or secular. Christians are generally asked to believe in God, not as some fictional representative value judgment, but as a real entity existing independently of the human mind, who really came to Earth as a human and was really crucified by the Romans as a historical fact. If Peterson thinks
The
that
same friend.
God is scripture, fictional in nature, then he is simply, in almost anybody else's terminology, an atheist. So, does Peterson think that the events of the Bible are fictional?
I'm trying my
Or does he
best
think
to
that they really
fucking
happened?
release later.
Well, let's take a listen.
I
The Old
absolutely do.
Testament reports in the book of Exodus that the Jews were enslaved in Egypt before embarking on a journey through the wilderness after being liberated from their slavery. Moses is said to part the Red Sea during the escape, which he then drops on the Pharaoh and his soldiers, drowning all of them and facilitating the Jewish escape. Quite a specific series of events. So, Dr. Peterson, do you think that the events of Exodus actually happened, or are they just fiction?
You might ask, well, did the events in Exodus really happen? And our conclusion was, well, not only did they happened in a meta manner.
Incredible. What an incredible apologetics. Oh, meta manner. Meta manner. They happened in a meta manner. I understand what it means, but
They're still happening.
yes. No. I understand what it means, but it's just... You cannot call yourself a Christian and be like this. You can call yourself Jordan Peterson, but not Christian.
with such reality that they haven't stopped happening. And what does that mean? Well, everyone still struggles with the spirit of tyranny. And everyone still
I want to
struggles
see
with
Alex's
the
face.
fact that when you escape from a
Just
tyranny,
once more.
you don't hit the promised land, you
Once
hit the
more.
desert. And then when you're in the desert of your imagination or with your lost peers, then you need to struggle with what guides you and what should guide you when you're lost. And then you have to grapple with the problem of
Do I have to wait for much
appropriate
more?
and
Fine.
reliable forms of governance, because that's all part of the Exodus story. And so it didn't happen the way a happening would occur if you just detailed it out as a camera holding empirical observer. It happened in a way deeper way that just doesn't stop happening.
So, when asked, did the Exodus really happen, Peterson says, it's still happening. What? The Jews are still wandering in the desert? Moses is still moseying around and parting seas? Look, I get what Peterson is saying. The story of Exodus describes a struggle with tyranny and the aftermath of liberation, and these are themes that are still relevant and true today. But Peterson is smart enough to know that he's being asked a simple historical question. Did the events historically occur? Regardless of how true the message is today, did the events described actually happen? And for some inexplicable reason, rather than simply saying, well, the Exodus didn't actually happen, it's a fictional story, but it contains themes that are universally true about human nature, Peterson refers to it as a
In a meta.
I lost
claim that
fucking
it's
everything that
still
I
actually happening
obtained
today.
They're still
and
happening.
acquired.
And I haven't
in
just
terms of
cherry-picked
knowledge.
a bad example of Peterson failing to properly explain his views. This keeps happening. Here's another example, this time on the story of Cain and Abel from the book of Genesis, this time taken from a podcast that Peterson conducted with my good friend Mohammed Hijab.
I did a lecture last night at the Apollo on the story of Cain and Abel, and one of the things that I proposed was that not only did that story happen, but it's always happening. It always happened. It's happening right now, and it's always going to happen into the future. And so I would say to some degree, the reduction of these profound stories to a historical reality is an underestimate of their truth, because they're a strange kind of truth, because they're the truth that always happens, is happening now, and always will happen. So
Why am I so unprecise? I cannot do anything that requires any sort of precision.
the spirit of joyful and appropriate sacrifice, which is characterizes Abel, and the spirit of resentful resentment against the structure of existence as a consequence of thrownness and the shaking of the fist at God. And that's always happening.
Once again, Peterson is simply describing good fiction. Did the events occur? No. But the story describes truths about human nature that have always been true. That's literally what this reduces to. I mean, imagine if someone were to ask me, did the Battle of Hogwarts really happen? Like, was it a historical event? And I said,
I'm gonna
it
go
happened
kill
with
myself.
such reality that it's still happening. Because the importance of
press
sacrificing our
so late.
safety to protect good against evil,
As
and
always,
the
I'm
notion
so
that like
dumb. I'm
evil
so
is
dumb
always
and not
pressing up against
smart.
the walls of our castle, man, that's a deeper
Can be
truth
pressed
than
so
calling
late.
it mere fiction can capture. I would sound like an idiot, and this is my utter confusion with Jordan Peterson. Why is he so hesitant to answer the question that everybody wants to know? Do you think these events actually took place? Did a man literally rise from the dead as a historical fact? Did the Jews, once enslaved in Egypt, travel to the promised land through the
You know
wilderness?
why.
And since Peterson sees these stories as fictional, meta-truths,
In a meta manner.
the answer is clearly no.
Fuck.
Sure, the ideas contained within the stories are real and pertain to the ongoing human condition. Okay, that doesn't make the events meta-true. It just makes them like any other story of a historical event that yet speak to an important aspect of human experience. Fiction. This is something that Douglas Murray actually points out to Jordan Peterson, comparing religious stories to stories of the novelist
Dostoevsky.
Dostoevsky, obviously, if you say is Dostoevsky true, you need to say in what sense. But then, I mean, the issue with the Bible, the issue
Why?
with Christianity, the issue with faith, is that it's obviously different. It's not in a different realm. It's clearly in a different realm because it claims different things for itself. Dostoevsky doesn't demand that we believe that Raskolnikov lived. The Bible, if you're going to be a believer, you have to be able to say, in the words of the creed, that you believe in the virgin birth, that you believe, most importantly, in the resurrection. And as you well know, Jordan, many of us can walk 99% of the way there in terms of belief in the story. Or as Betjeman puts it,
I'm going
is
to
it
die to this
true?
from
Is
zero,
it
you know?
true?
How many
And then
times?
stumble
10!
on the last thing.
Quite right. And listen to what Peterson has to say about Dostoevsky.
When I read something like a novel by Dostoevsky, I think, well, is this true? And the answer is, well, those precise events never happened. So on that basis, it's not true. But then there's something wrong with that description because the characterizations in Dostoevsky are so true that in some
Yeah, because Dostoevsky, you know what he used to do? He wrote, he actually just described real people. Like, he just took someone he knew personally, I guess, and just wrote them, like, how they would act. Of course, he probably also there was some fiction to it, and the actions were fictional, but other than that, that's why his characters are so epic.
sense they've never been surpassed.
See? How hard was that? Those precise events never happened, but the characterizations are deeply true. Why can he not say the same thing about Cain
You
and Abel,
know
or about
why.
Exodus? I mean, just compare these two responses.
When I read something like a novel by Dostoevsky, I think, well, is this true? And the answer is, well, those precise events never happened.
When I look at a story like Cain and Abel, I think, well, the question, did that happen, begs the question, what do you mean by happen? Because when you are dealing with fundamental
Jordan
realities, when you
Peterson.
pose a question, you have to understand that the reality of the concepts of your question, when you're digging
And
that
yet
deep,
you
are
don't like trans people. So you think events can you think events can happen in a meta manner, and yet you do not believe a guy can be born in a female body or otherwise. So events in Bible in a meta manner, yes, that's completely true, that they're still happening. But no, I can't be a girl if I have a dick. No. Not even in a meta manner. Well, I'm not sure what his position actually is. I know partially, but that doesn't fucking matter most of the time.
just as questionable about as what you're questioning.
For some reason, when the fictional story in question is a scriptural story, Peterson becomes unable to describe it as fiction in the way that he would describe literally any other meaningful but ahistorical story as fiction. Indeed, he appears to become unable to string a meaningful sentence together at all when he's talking about this stuff. If the Exodus is still happening, then on the same justification that Peterson gives, Raskolnikov murdering Alyona Ivanovna is still happening. But that would be a ridiculous characterization of what fiction is. And so if somebody asked me if the events of Crime and Punishment actually happened, I'd simply say no. Okay, next I want to give you a specific example of something which I think demonstrates how Jordan Peterson uses language in a deliberately vague and elusive manner to support his strange claims about belief in God. The specific example I'm going to give here is an incredibly bold claim made by Peterson in both his podcast with Jonathan Pajow and with Lex Friedman. Peterson claims in these clips that a prerequisite is having some kind of transcendent,
no.
theistic, that is.
I never had this third position, but apparently I need it.
Here it is in his own words.
And then I was thinking, well, what's the precondition for being a scientist?
Oh,
There's theistic preconditions because one of the
how's
characteristics
you
of
so
science,
hard?
and this includes people like Dawkins,
How?
is that the scientist presumes
How is it harder
axiomatically
than the wave?
that there's a transcendent realm outside the domain of epistemological theory.
Okay, so why is it then that to be a scientist you have to
What did you do?
presuppose the existence of some transcendent reality that is deistic in nature? Well, let's listen to him explaining this to Lex Friedman.
Do you believe in the transcendent if you're a scientist?
What?
And the answer is, well, not only do you believe in it, you believe in it more than anything else. Because if you're a scientist, you believe in what objects to your theory more than you believe in your theory. Now, you've got to think that through very carefully. So your theory describes the world, and as far as you're concerned, your description of the world is the world. But because you're a scientist, you think, well, even though that's my description of the world and that's what I believe, there's something beyond what I believe. And that's the object. And so I'm going to throw my theory against the object and see where it'll break.
I
Okay,
thought
so
I
Peterson
was.
has just described the process of scientific inquiry, and he makes an important point, which is that scientists spend more time trying to disprove their theories than really trying to prove them, or at least they try to prove
What did
them
you
by
do?
failure to disprove them. Science usually involves testing a hypothesis against things that might disprove that hypothesis, so that if something does, we can adapt the theory. It's a quite straightforward observation. But listen to how Peterson characterizes it.
And so I'm going to throw my theory against the object and see where it'll break. And then I'm going to use the evidence of the break as a source of new information to revitalize my theory. So as a scientist, you have to posit the existence of an ontological transcendence.
It's not
before
a
you can move
fucking
forward.
death.
Whoa, hold on. All a scientist needs to posit to do science is the existence of truths that we currently don't know about. We have a theory, a set of theories, but there are lots of true things about the world that aren't encompassed by our theories. So we have to take our theory and test it against this unknown world to learn new things. But Peterson likes to describe this unknown world as the ontological transcendent.
So as a scientist, you have to posit the existence of the ontological transcendence.
Fuck!
But that's not justified at all. I think Peterson is confusing epistemology with ontology.
I'm so hot.
Epistemology is about
Fuck!
knowledge of things, whereas ontology
Not
is about the way
sexy,
they
I mean.
actually are. For an example of the
I mean, I'm
difference,
fucking
if I
hot,
flip a
I'm
coin,
sweating.
then epistemologically, it could be heads and it could be tails. But ontologically speaking, it of course has to in fact actually only be one of these things. So this world of truths that exists outside of our current scientific description of the world may be epistemologically transcendent, that is, it transcends what we currently know scientifically, but it's not ontologically transcendent, that is, transcendent in the religious sense of actually transcending nature.
What
Because we
was
have no
this
reason to
part?
believe that. Remember, Peterson is just talking here about truths outside of our current scientific theories.
So your theory describes the world, and as far
Why
as you're
does
concerned,
hair?
your description of the world
What?
is the world.
Why?
But
Why did
because
this
you're a
hair
scientist,
fall
you
on
think,
my
well,
forehead?
even though
Why do I
that's
have
my
to fix
description
it
of the world and
again?
that's what I believe, there's something beyond what I believe.
But instead of just referring to this as the unknown
My
or
hair
something,
makes it so
Peterson
hard not to
decides to use
sweat.
the term transcendent.
Ontological transcendent.
Why? If you ask me, it's got something to do with the religious connotations of the word transcendent. And so, instead of just making
more
a
time to
simple
drop
and
it.
obvious claim that
If I
scientists
even can.
believe in truths that lie outside of our current understanding, which of course they do, science is literally the process of
If I
uncovering
even
these
can get
truths as
one more
best we
time to the
can.
drop.
Peterson decides to claim that scientists have to believe in the ontologically transcendent. I hope you can see why this is misleading. So why is Peterson
If
making
I will
this
be
mistake?
able to withstand it.
Why is he suggesting
not
that
die
believing
to
in
the memory
truths
part.
outside of our current scientific description of the world requires believing in the ontologically transcendent? Well, I think it might have something to do with something that we've just heard him say.
So your theory describes the world, and as far as you're concerned, your description of the world is the world.
Here's the problem. a scientist does not think that their
What?
description of the world is the world. They think it accurately describes part of how the world functions. Indeed, to be a good scientist at all, a scientist has to understand that there does exist a world beyond their current scientific description to be explored and tested against. So to say that a scientist thinks that their theory is the world in its totality is totally wrong and quite bizarre. And even more bizarrely, what I've just said is something that Peterson says himself right afterwards, seemingly contradicting himself immediately.
So your theory describes the world, and as far as you're concerned, your description of the world is the world.
How did this happen?
But because you're a scientist, you think, well, even though that's my description of the world and that's what I believe, there's something beyond what I believe.
So here is an apparent contradiction. He says that to a scientist, their description of the world is the world, but then immediately says that a scientist will recognize that there's more to the world than their description of it. Make that make sense. Well, this is why I think we get this strange claim about scientists presuming the ontologically transcendent. Because Peterson has claimed that a scientist's theory to them is the world, then when a scientist considers things that currently lie outside of their theory, they must be considering things that are not of the world, or in other words, transcendent, in the sense that they actually transcend the world. That's where I think he's getting the word from. So I said a moment ago that he's using the word transcendent just because of its religious connotations, but here's another option. Maybe he really thinks that a scientist is to them the entire world, and so when they think of something outside of their theory, they're thinking of something transcendent. But that doesn't make sense either, because of course, to simply recognize that something exists outside of our current description is not to recognize the ontologically transcendent. It's just to say that there are things about nature that we currently do not know. That's it. But Peterson actually responds to my objection here as follows.
This is a very complicated topic, right? You believe in a transcendent
Alright,
reality.
you use
See, okay, now let's say
left
you
fucking
buy
part
the
of your finger
argument I
pad.
just made on the natural front. You say, yeah,
How did I only notice
that's
now?
just nature. That's not God.
Yes, that is pretty much what I'm saying.
Fuck.
This world that exists outside of our current scientific description does not have to be God, does not have to be transcendent. It can just be the rest of nature
Yeah,
that
of
we
course.
don't yet understand.
And then I'd say, well, what makes you think you know what nature is? Like, see, the problem with that argument is that it already presumes a materialist, a reductionist, materialist, objective view of what constitutes nature.
Wait, hold on. Do you see what's just happened? Peterson says, first, that scientists believe in something outside of their current theoretical description of the world.
Fuck.
I agree. He then says that this has to be transcendent and deistic. I say, well, hold on, why can't it just be nature? And he says, well, can you prove that? Can you prove that it's just nature? How do you even know what nature is? Well, no, I can't prove that. But I never claimed to be able to. Excuse me, but I'm not the one claiming scientists have to be materialists. You're the one claiming that they have to be deistic. You're the one making the claim, not me. If I made the claim that scientists have to presuppose naturalism, then yes, I'd need to give some evidence for this. But I'm not making that claim. You're
My
making the
pupils
claim
rotated
that belief
differently
in
because of the
something
jump in the
outside
beginning.
of our current theories has to be, for some reason, transcendent and deistic, and can't just be natural. You're the one who has to back that up. So, the first mistake that I think Peterson makes on this science and religion stuff is to confuse facts that are not currently encompassed by our scientific description of the world with ontologically transcendent truths. But then, he also, as a second step, and basically with no justification, claims that these transcendent truths have to be deistic in nature.
What's the precondition for being a scientist? And I thought, well, in some sense, it's a there's deistic preconditions.
Where the hell did that bit come from? Well, for all my searching, this is the best explanation that I can find from Peterson.
So as a scientist, you have to posit the existence of the ontological transcendent before you can move forward
I
at all.
didn't mean to
But more,
leave the level.
you have to posit that contact with the ontological transcendent, annoying though it is because it upsets your apple cart, is exactly what will in fact set you free. So then you accept the proposition that there is a transcendent reality, and that contact with that transcendent reality is redemptive in the most fundamental sense, because if it wasn't, well, why would you bother making contact with it? You're going to make everything worse or better?
Right, so Peterson is clarifying that in order to do science, a scientist must be motivated. They must somehow think that by discovering new truths, they're achieving some good or doing something worthwhile. Of course, this is true in a sense. In order to do anything, we need a motivation to do it. But Peterson insists that a scientist's motivation has to be that they'll be set free by it, and that this will be redemptive. Why would he choose these terms? Again, like transcendent, I think that he's purposefully using religiously charged language to make this quite straightforward observation seem like it has religious significance, where it in fact does not. One of the most famous passages from the Gospel of John is John 8:32. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And of course, redemption is the key project of the New Testament. So
Why is
Peterson
the
is
QFO
using
not
words
easy?
that play on Christian themes, but as I say, I think he's doing this unjustifiably. Why does a scientist have to believe
Why
that
is UFO not
science will
free?
set them
Why is
free?
this UFO?
Well, this is something that Lex Friedman actually asks.
Why does the contact with the transcendent set you free as a scientist?
Because you assume, I mean, freedom in the most fundamental sense. It's like, well, freedom from want, freedom from disease, freedom from ignorance, right? That it informs you.
But do you see how this is a bit ridiculous? Peterson just said it's because a scientist thinks that science will set us free from ignorance or inform us.
Right? That it informs you.
But what a strange way to phrase it. Instead of saying that a scientist thinks that science will inform us or increase our knowledge or something like that, Peterson insists that science will set us free from ignorance. There's nothing strictly wrong with using this phrasing. It's a bit more poetic and pretty. But here it's clearly being used in such a way as to suggest that science is religious in nature by making a not so subtle nod to the Bible. Same thing with redemptive.
Redemptive in the most fundamental sense, because if it wasn't, well, why would you bother making contact with it? You're going to make everything worse or better?
Sure, science can increase our well-being by curing diseases and the like, but the word redemptive seems like it's been chosen to inject religious imagery. And if you don't believe me, just think about it for a second. Imagine that I were on a road trip. We were reading a map.
It is
and
so
the map
off.
told me where to
It is
exit the
so
highway.
off.
And
Do
then
I
claimed
have to
that
quit
because
Geometry
this map
Dash
informed me of something that I didn't already know.
after this attempt?
The map didn't
After that
just
attempt?
inform me or help me direct my car, no. The map set me free from my ignorance after I contacted the ontologically transcendent, that is, the directions that were outside of my knowledge, and this has been redemptive in the sense that it's made things better for me. I'm now going in the right direction. That's right. Conditions.
Theistic preconditions.
Because to read a map, you have to believe that there exists the ontologically transcendent, that which is outside of your current description
No
of the
precision
world.
for me.
And you have to believe
Zero.
that by engaging with it, you set yourself free in a way that's redemptive. That's the idea that you're being sold here. I really hope that you can see through it now. The thing that Peterson is actually describing when he talks about how science works is about as straightforward and banal as my description of how a map works. But just by dressing it up as religious
I don't want to
imagery,
hit
it makes it sound a lot
my
more
table
profound
because
than it
spacebar
actually
will
is,
fucking
if you're not
press
listening
itself.
carefully. Not only does he make it sound more profound, he makes it sound more religious. So just like when he describes fictional stories in the Bible as meta-truths, he's allowing himself to sound like he's committing himself to quite profound, spiritual, supernatural and religious claims without actually doing anything of the kind. All of this serves to obscure a truly straightforward and ordinary how science works behind a wall of religious imagery, which, intentionally or not, is vastly misleading. I mean, let's put this argument first in Jordan Peterson's own terms, and then in more straightforward language. Jordan Peterson has given an argument that scientists must assume a transcendent deistic reality. And that's because a scientist must believe in a transcendent reality contact with which is redemptive and sets us free. Now let's hear the same thing without the poetic terminology and without confusing a scientist's description of the world for the world. Peterson argues that scientists must believe in truths not currently captured by the scientific description of the world, and that uncovering these truths will make us less ignorant and sometimes allow us to improve our welfare, such as in medical research.
Go fuck yourself first.
That's it.
But it was corrected
That is what
though.
he's argued. And somehow this leads to deism? I just don't see it. This is why I think you have to be duly cautious when dealing with Jordan Peterson. By subtly playing around with definitions, and by using terms that aren't always strictly inaccurate, but in highly unusual contexts, he can begin making bizarre claims, like you can't be secular in a museum.
Are you looking at art? Yes. Well, what makes you think you're secular then?
Or scientists have to presuppose deism.
There's deistic preconditions.
Or the Exodus is still happening.
They happened in a meta manner. They're still happening.
I think that a good summary of where it is that Peterson goes wrong when talking about religion can be found in the following clip, in which he considers whether the Christian logos, that is, Jesus himself, is divine.
The divinity of Christ. Well, I would say the same problems with the question formulation obtained. What do you mean by divine? And also, what do you mean by Christ? These are very, very difficult questions. Now, I believe that, for all intents and purposes, I believe that the Logos is divine. Insofar as if by divine you mean of ultimate value, of ultimate
of all
transcendent
deaths,
value,
that
yes,
no,
it's
no,
divine.
no,
But
no,
who
no,
does
that is
mean
not
that
irrational.
by divine?
No,
I mean, seriously,
anything.
when somebody asks if Jesus is divine, they're clearly asking if he is God, or at least God-like. By
Anything
simply
but that. Anything but
redefining
that.
divine to mean something more convenient and more secular, Peterson can then say that the Logos is divine. But he's simply now talking about something completely different, and something that isn't even supernatural anymore. In conclusion, I think that we should stop allowing Jordan Peterson to get away with a vagueness of language that we wouldn't accept in any other context. He's so loose with definitions and meanings when talking about religion that, as Mohammed Hijab points out, he begins to sound like a postmodernist.
When I was reading your book, you were talking about some psychological theory, which I don't forget. I forget what it is right now. You mentioned something. You said this, the problem with this such and such theory is that it doesn't have any evidence. Full stop. Categorically. All this, what you're doing now, you didn't mention that. You didn't say, well, it depends on what you mean by this, it depends on what you... Sorry to say that. But it depends on what you mean. What? You become postmodern all of a sudden.
I mean, just listen here to Peterson asking,
Why did he talk to this guy? This guy is
Depends on what you mean by this.
disgrace to human beings. What?
So it depends on what you...
I wonder if this is the interview where Jordan Peterson just left.
Sorry to say, yeah. But it depends on what you mean by this, it depends on what you mean. You become
Is that
postmodern all of a sudden.
I mean, just listen here to Peterson asking, does God exist?
People say to me, do you believe in God? And I think, okay, there's a couple of mysteries in that question. What do you mean do? What do you mean you? What do you mean believe? And what do you mean God? And you say as the questioner, well, we already know what all those things mean except belief in God. And I think, no, if we're going to get down to the fundamental brass tacks, we don't really know what any of those things mean.
You become postmodern all of a sudden.
Just imagine that he was being asked about literally any other context. Say, Dr. Peterson, do you believe that George Washington crossed the Delaware River in 1776?
Okay, there's a couple of mysteries in that question. What do you mean do? What do you mean you? What do you mean believe? And what do you mean George Washington? And you say as the questioner, well, we already know what all those things mean. We don't really know what any of those things mean.
In any other context, we would accuse Peterson of purposefully obfuscating the question in order to avoid giving a straight answer. Is that what he's doing here? Well, that would depend on what you mean by is. Not doing. But yes, probably. So, Jordan Peterson seems, to me, to be an atheist. God is a fictional character.
God is the ultimate fictional character.
And that religious scripture is true, but only true in the sense that it contains a meaningful message that speaks to the human experience, regardless of its historicity. I just wish that in future we would take the advice of Rule 10 and be a bit more precise in exercising this particular opinion. I've been Alex O'Connor, or Cosmic Skeptic, and this video took a great deal of effort, and I couldn't have done it without my supporters on Patreon, especially my top tier supporters. If you like my content, please
Why
do
do you
consider
need
visiting my
supporters,
Patreon and
Alex?
the link in the description.
It's because
Don't
you
forget
believe
to
in
subscribe.
God, isn't
Thank you
it?
for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
I just can't. What? What?
Do you think that
No! I fucking
For a man who
hate.
titled
I fucking hate autoplay on YouTube. Fucking hate that with all my soul. That ruined me. And a very good attempt once. I want to hit my table so much. The desk, I mean. My desk is actually just a kitchen table. And that's why I refer to it that way. That's not a skill issue, that's a gene issue. I'm so fucking tired of that. Fuck. I thought I decided to kill myself on my own. That's unlearnable. You cannot improve with that. Everyone can except for me. But I can't. It just does not get fucking better. Never did. Over the past fucking 3 years. Or 4. Never. What is that even? What is that? What is that? There's no fucking coffee anymore in my fucking glass. I almost threw it into the monitor. Who the fuck is surprised? Nobody. Fuck! Of course I have fucking anger bursts because I was so anxious before playing. For no reason, just for no reason. I was so fucking anxious before playing. Of course I have anger outbursts. try so hard not to hit my keyboard. I try so hard not to lose my voice. Fucking beautiful music. I can't play anymore. I can't do that anymore. It's too bad I can't do that. But I can't. I will fucking break something if I continue doing that. Right. How is that? How is that the fucking case? Fuck. Just hold for fucking longer. Why? Why? It just doesn't exist! Muscle memory for this type of precision. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. It just doesn't get better. Never, fucking never. Alright, one more fucking attempt and my keyboard just going gonna get launched into my monitor, so I will unfortunately have to stop playing because I'm not mentally stable. Anyways, I think we got some great runs, undoubtedly. Those were basically 23 to 98 in a 2 attempt practice run. I think it was basically 23 to 62 or 61 and 59 to 98. So basically, also we got 5 to 62 maybe and 35. So well, not much. And I also didn't get a new best run to 100, but that means fucking nothing. This level is retarded. Getting a run to fucking 98 is as good as because it doesn't matter if you die to 98, because you will always die to 98 if you're not genetically modified and predisposed to this fucking stupid game. So it doesn't really matter much. So don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. Yes, 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 yes. Let me remove the dirt from my key that I used to play on would be revolved on another. Also, you need to have nails, guys, to clean your fucking keyboard if you're a Geometry Dash player. I will tell you what, Aruna. I need a fucking cigarette, it seems to me. Any good what? Fucking or slapping on the ass. In the ass. But I won't have it. I don't want to. But I definitely need it. A good huge dick up my ass, yeah. But no, not today. Alright, guys. Oh yeah, and the song is ending.